I'm about to bust. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought this was the bathroom. Oh, good Lord!
I'll try to open the show in the only way that I feel is proper. Let me see if I can pull this off with the sound equipment. Yep. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Longhouse, a show about art, culture, politics, etc., all with a true right Texan perspective today, as we're going to be looking back and reminiscing about the show King of the Hill. As always, welcome back, Ludwig Path, my trusty co-host.
Yep.
And with us, we have an American representative in the form of Jay Burden. Welcome, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about King of the Hill.
Am I? And just take a chug of that beer here. Okay. We're getting some shit in the chat for being late. We'll blame that on technical difficulties. And you know, it's in fashion to be late. Let's put it that way. Do we want to talk a bit about our, background knowledge for the show before we get into it, or do we want to just go to current events first, Ludwig?
Well, I guess we could do like a quick rundown on the backgrounds that we have. I mean, from my perspective, I was sort of vaguely aware that this show existed when I was younger. I'd watched some of Mike Judge's other shows like Beavis and Butthead and so on, but I didn't watch King of the Hill in its entirety until I was an adult, watching it with my wife. So I just watched it canonically from like the first season until the last season. And of course, it's been a while now, but I still think I remember enough to make some coherent comments on the show and have fun with it.
Yeah, Jay Burden, what about you?
So I actually primarily watched it through two ways. One, my parents are fairly young, and so my dad, being in his mid-40s, is very connected to Beavis and Butthead and kind of like the earlier Mike Judge stuff, and so he loved it, and I would sometimes watch it with him. And then also I have a really close friend recently in his wedding, but he was really into YouTube poop, and it's a form of humor I don't understand. It's essentially like random access humor.
Is this your dad?
No, this is one of my good friends. My dad is not.
Because I had a friend as well that was very into YouTube poop.
My dad's into YouTube poop, guys.
He probably wouldn't be.
He was how young? You say?
So yeah, my dad is in his mid-40s, and then my friend is my age, and so I kind of had those two influences. One, just watching the show, kind of, like you normally would on TV with my dad, and the other way, kind of absorbing it through meme culture, as other among my other Zoomer friends.
It's got a lot of quotable moments, doesn't it? And we'll probably get into that at some point. But yeah, thinking about it, I think, YouTube poop is probably something that could only have come from a generation of online teenagers. Which is why I thought it was funny.
Apparently people think it's funny, but to me, it is like that. Like it's almost too scrambled for me to get anything out of.
Yeah, I have a hard time sort of getting it because it's too sort of rapid fire.
It's very much in the time, like with the way TikTok videos are structured now, and like the memes the kids are into these days. They have to be like rapid fire, even though they don't do the poops explicitly anymore. But I think sometimes like these YouTube poops are easier to get into if they have an element that from before. I remember watching like Stefan Molyneux shows that they'd cut into these YouTube poops, and I would just laugh my ass off at them. You'd probably laugh at them too. I mean, if you're watching something that's like you don't have any context for what's going on, then it's just noise, right?
Right. Well, there's one guy on Twitter I enjoy. I'm not sure if this qualifies as YouTube poop or like that sort of content, but he like recuts Jordan Peterson talks into like these strange rants. about like rats or against women and stuff like that. But that's as far as I can go.
In the
Anything more
future,
than that
those
is just noise.
in the future, those rants will be indistinguishable from the actual Jordan Peterson videos, I think.
Yeah, you beat me by
Merit.
like half a second there.
I mean, I paid some attention to the cigar stream yesterday, and I pulled down the script to be able to read along, and I was starting to I read a bit ahead, and it just got more and more confusing, which is strange because I have read 12 Rules for Life, which is very easy to read. So I'm not sure
that's
what's
what
happening
I'm
there.
surprised by. Like, it was just from a perspective of writing, it was a mess. Like,
Yeah.
it really reminded me of like when I was in university, and I would procrastinate till last minute and try to write, 10 pages in a couple hours and look at the next day and be like, oh, this is a mess. And that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah, some of those sentences feel very padding.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the sentiments that I had going into, I mean, they were echoed in the chat and by the participants of the stream, like the idea that he sounds like a French philosopher now. He spent all his career, railing against Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and all these people, and now he sounds like them, basically trying to just explain simple ideas using extremely complicated language. I did actually put out, in a bit of the spirit of the stream, I put out a meme on my channel, like relating to this specific thing, because I'd sit and watch through some of Jordan Peterson's videos. And of course, he's coming out with a book now that's called "We Who Wrestle with God," right? And he's sitting there with some like younger, antsy guy who's just really excited to be there and interview Jordan, and he's talking about, with this book, we're going to go really deep. We're going to go really deep into the subject matter this time, and I'm not holding, with the book, you can be so precise, and I'm not going to pull any punches and so on. It's just, and he starts doing this regular babble stuff where it's just going to, the word use is one thing that you pointed out, where he starts talking about the biblical corpus. The biblical corpus. What the fuck is the biblical corpus? I know there's such a thing as the Bible that has books in it, but it's like I've never heard anybody talk about the biblical corpus before he brought it up. It's just like
he might be trying to pull some sort of like Carlyleism by inventing words, but he's not able to actually, because the weird thing about Carlyle is that he invents like a word, but you sort of like in your bones exactly know what he's talking about. He's able to sort of channel some sort of
neologisms, I guess that's
word.
the term. But I mean, that's only useful if you actually describe something that people don't have a word for already. I mean, there's a name for the biblical corpus. It's called the Bible, right? Yeah, it's much simpler. So he keeps just making up these stories and talking about how deep the book is, and like his quick explanation is basically that he's just going to explain how like the different chapters of the Bible. It's like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Like that's real. That's his thesis. Like that's
he's going to reverse engineer everything. Yeah.
Yes. Like, well, do you believe in God? Well, that depends. God is described as the voice who calls out in the wilderness to those who are willing to listen. Well, are you willing to listen? Well, then you believe in God, because then you must be brave, and so it's like, well, yeah, God is basically
then you're in
like
the whale. Yeah
exactly. Then God is like the intuition you get to go on the hero's journey, and that's going to be his entire point. And he's not actually going to read the Bible. He's not going to bring up any biblical scholars or anything like that, or biblical history. It's just going to.
Man, I'd love to see the numbers for that. If anyone were able to ever record that. Which they aren't, but how many people have Jordan Peterson converted to Christianity by like accident? Because they end up reading the Bible and then they probably convert.
I think it's probably higher than you'd think. I will say, like, I was probably at the right target age, for JBP right when he came out. And it's a little bit disappointing to see him end up like this. And look, some of it was the benzos, I get that. But it is a little bit like every single time he comes back worse, because those biblical lectures are interesting at the very least. I personally know probably a half dozen guys my age. Yeah, I would even maybe count myself in that, who he was very, very helpful for. Like essentially, like within like a few months of finding him, like it kind of turned my life around. And I don't know, it's always a little bit sad for me on kind of like an emotional level, because look, I haven't read anything he's done really like actively in years now, but it is kind of one of those things where it's like, I don't know if it always makes me sad seeing him like this, if you see what I mean. And I think a lot of people share that feeling.
Yes. I mean, I mentioned this, I think, on the first Longhouse stream, but I actually saw him live in Oslo. And I mean, for those who remember, I could just retell the story really quickly, because this was his 12 Rules for Life tour, right? So I had some friends who were into Jordan Peterson, and I went along with them. And of course, because like the Norwegian kind of, you could call it alt-right, or this sort of right-wing milieu, it's so small, right? So everybody was there, right? Everybody who was
All five
into
of us.
like this, like Hans-Jørgen Lysglimt Johansen was there, a lot of these people from like the Liberalistene, the Libertarian Party, were there, and the hall was packed, right? And Dave Rubin introduces Jordan Peterson, and there's like a lot of energy in the hall, and there's people are buying beers, they're standing drinking, and then like, okay, give it up for Jordan Peterson, everybody claps, and he walks out like the crooked man, like he's like 120 years old. He could barely sort of move onto the middle of the stage, and he sort of like shambles around very carefully, speaking quietly into the microphone, and he couldn't take any questions afterward, and you'd have to like pay money to go on an extra, sort of question round where you would sit in this little quiet corner and just sit and ask him things. So, I mean, already then I knew there was something like seriously wrong with him, and like this was during his like heavy benzo addiction period before he went into rehab. And I mean, he got back, and like you said, he's he seems like to be a glutton for punishment. He just keeps coming back worse and worse every time. But I think part of the problem is also that he is as old as he is, and he really tries to do everything now. He tries to be like a political philosopher and like do geopolitics and like, I mean, pretty much everything. What hasn't he tried at this point, right?
I also, to me, I can't help but see the Daily Wire's like kind of hooks in him to a certain degree.
Oh yeah.
And
he's been I forget the word. What's the other conservative online outlet?
Breitbart?
No, sorry. I'll give me a bit. Just talk. I'll find it.
Oh, but to me at least, and feel free to jump back in whenever you find your thought. It seems very much like the kind of like hyper commercialization of like Ben Shapiro's business model is kind of just tearing him apart. Like to me, it's like that was a bad fit for him.
He's like PragerU.
Oh yeah,
Jordan
definitely.
B. Peterson now. It's like Jordan has died and he's been replaced by like an AI Jordan Peterson that's been fed a lot of PragerU talking points.
Well, my question is that, I mean, is he poor or something? I mean, I'd imagine he'd have enough money at this point to comfortably retire and then just write a book or something, because he's probably being paid like massive amounts of money from the Daily Wire. The way I look at it, it's like the chosen people have acquired him as an asset, right? And they have to sort of milk him for everything it's worth, and make him just like come up with these like these manifestos and these speeches that are just, I mean, it's really just like reconfirming the system that already exists, completely neutralizing him as a threat and just spouting their talking points.
Why does he sound like the preacher guy from Skyrim when he does it? Anyway,
I wish I played more Skyrim. Yeah,
I just had a vague memory. He has a weird way of reading off that thing, which is why I ended up trying to read it instead when he does the manifesto. Anyway,
well, that's one of the weirdest things about it, is that as someone who's had, not a ton, but a decent amount of kind of like public speaking training, his diction is indecipherable. Like it's so weird, and it's worse than even just like untrained diction, because he's, you see videos of him speaking, and even in his very earliest videos, like he's a very good lecturer, graded on the scale of like college.
Yeah, I'd say some of the appeal of Jordan Peterson is, the ability to watch someone on stage sort of live walking through their trains of thought, right? In the way that he does. But that's all just gone, right?
Yeah, and he tries to get into territories that he's just not familiar with. Most of his life is just spent on this kind of psychology and a lot of this kind of new age spirituality stuff, and doing lectures to relatively small audiences. And his strength has always been that he could be with a live audience and actually read the room pretty comfortably and try to adapt himself. But when he's going to do like standalone videos, particularly with larger amounts of content, then it tends to fall apart because he has nothing to reflect back. In a sense, he's just sitting there with his own thoughts, and it just turns into a mess.
Probably. Anyway, that's enough Peterson bashing for one episode. Let's bring up the current events, the other current events, which is our boy Kanye, the new member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who named some people on TV. It was during a Tucker Carlson interview, if I remember correctly. Let's see if I can find. Do you want to play the video, buddy?
Nah, we don't need to play any videos on this. I assume most of the people have seen the interview now. It's still fully available. The thing is that, I mean, Academic Agent covered so much of this story already, so there's just certain things with the Kanye thing that I'd like to touch on. I mean, we talked about this previously, Walrus, how a lot of these Norwegian so-called like right-wing outlets have just not covered this thing at all. Like, I think the mainstream newspapers have spent more time actually covering the stuff that Kanye has talked about than something like Document.no and Reset and so on. It's quite embarrassing when you get something like this, even with the the DEFCON tweets and so on. I mean, that Tucker Carlson interview is basically getting, if you are on the right wing, this is like getting red meat served on a silver platter. Basically, you can just kind of repeat the stuff that he said on your news outlet to talk about these points, whether you want to talk about like this kind of like white, some kind of like white nationalism, white well-being topic. If you want to talk about the media and negative media influence, you want to talk about the JQ or like anything really of body positivity or something like that. You have so many opportunities when like the biggest rapper in the world comes out and says these things, and then Tucker Carlson brings him on. So it is kind of like two of these big characters that are coming out and endorsing these ideas, and they're just choosing not to cover it. It really tells you like the degree of con Inc. These
Power.
people are on, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and especially from the like anti-cancel culture crowd, like the cowardice is just kind of stunning, because this should be, obviously it's not due to some, let's just say some
we have to sort of remind ourselves that this is controlled opposition we're talking about. But go ahead.
Well, no, I agree. Well, I'm saying that it illustrates that very neatly, because kind of within their own internal logic, like, oh, this is this is exactly what they want. They want a celebrity. They love specifically like diverse celebrities, which is why I think that you saw the initial like rush to Kanye, when he was going on about like Dragon Force energy and wearing MAGA hats and all that. But then it's like, oh, the higher loyalty kicked in and it's done. And not even just it's done, like they're going to oppose him. They're just not even going to pretend he exists. And to me, like, that's the thing where it's like, okay, these people aren't your friends. They're not.
Yeah, a stronger power signaled to them that, this wasn't allowed.
Exactly. And so don't expect anything else from them. They've shown you their true colors. And I think for a lot of people, and this is something I've been trying to take from, people like Oren McIntyre, is that I think it's really easy for us to, like, okay, we've learned that lesson and move on. But if you don't act like you've learned the lesson, like people always saying like, oh, I've moved on from Moldbug. Well, no, you haven't. You keep making the same mistakes. And I think that you see that not necessarily like naming names, but in kind of like people like us and people like slightly to the normie side of us, who keep essentially like, like saying like, oh, like based Tucker, like, oh, based Fox News, they're going to like pull one over and they're going to be on our side. And then you see stuff like this and it's like, all right, like stop waiting for them. Like they're never going to do it.
Yeah, and the thing is that you don't even need to think about it like, oh, Kanye's our guy or Tucker's our guy. It's just, okay, somebody kicked the ball into your court, right? What are you going to do now? You've been given an opportunity to sort of talk on a certain topic, and you're not taking it. Basically, you're just sitting there, letting it fly by. I mean, with this stuff, they covered a lot of these on the AA stream. They covered a lot of the things that he was talking about. There's just a few things that weren't covered that I thought was interesting, because I've been paying attention to certain black celebrities now, and the way that they're kind of, I wouldn't say having an awakening, but some of the ones that are a little bit more based, at least from their perspective, and how they look at the world. And the stuff that Kanye is describing in this interview, I talked to you about it, Walrus, is that it's basically like the African American cathedral.
Yeah, I was going to say
like,
it's the same thing using black words.
Yes, but if Moldbog is talking about that we have, the New York Times and Harvard and Yale, as they just exist as this kind of consensus-making apparatus to make everybody walk in lockstep, then, like as Kanye explains it, like for black people, it's basically like the Gap and Nike shoes that are now just like these suits that exist to make black people have the same opinion on everything political, and if they want to participate in the arena, they have to hold the line on all of these talking points, and if they don't, then they're just going to be selected out. It's that's one point. And the other
thing
point
that happened today, by the way, is that JP Morgan kicked him out. So the bankers have literally made their move when it comes to the Kanye question, by the way. Yeah.
Interesting, but it's seemingly predictable. And the other thing he was talking about was the because AA has been talking about the sort of Lizzo stuff, and like that's the America versus Europe thing, and why is America promoting basically 120 kilogram black women and so on. But I mean, like from Kanye's perspective, and a lot of these Black Panther types, they don't see this as like black people being promoted. He used the term black genocide basically. Both with the promotion of like fat black people in magazines, and also with abortion, which of course he does have a point. I mean, it's very easy.
The same point as Richard Spencer does.
That's what I said. It's like black genocide. The media says that it's not happening, and Spencer says that it is happening, and it's a good thing. That's the
that's why abortion is good.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the registered Democrat first world wing of the dissident right. We vote Democrat to further this agenda along now. I mean, I'm kidding a little bit, but not really actually.
Well, I think one other thing to take away from this is that, and look, like I'm not surprised by this, but it's just something to note. The kind of like consistent, like abiding, like just pure ethno-narcissism of this community. Where there's no issue that isn't some way related to like kind of odd conspiracies to kill all black people, that's going to be clipped, but you know what I mean? Like that every social ill is with that one end in mind. It's like the only way that like people in that community can really conceptualize any problem. And it's interesting to see it even with things as a kind of, I guess, like unconnected ostensibly as like, pornography, obesity, and whatever other issue Kanye's going at. It's all what this kind of like same. It's like their version of like the Nazis. Where it's like every ill is actually secretly that, no matter what.
But it's like peak slave morality thinking, right? Except Kanye is the one guy who isn't, and that's why he's where he's at, right? It's we covered this when I was on UO, the water not being fixed, and it's white people's fault because they're not there. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed this too. Many people have commented on it. I mean, with the black community, the sort of inability to create anything in terms of ideology, in terms of philosophy or art or something that's not about them specifically and their interest. Which, of course, you'd think that's from our perspective, that's kind of like, based, friend-enemy distinction, self-interest, and so on. But they're not doing great. We kind of have to admit that, it's not worked very well for them. If you look at the United States, I mean, I think Kanye, in a sense, does have a point where, they do have the most abortions. They're not, as far as I know, they're not growing demographically. The replacement is happening because of immigration from like other countries. It's not
they were doing great until like Martin Luther and Lyndon B. Johnson.
Of course. When we had the 1950s conservative values, and they were growing at 1% per year until welfare. I forgot.
Well, I mean, it's better than they're doing now, right?
Okay. Yeah, actually, I believe it. Actually, I'm going to believe that. I haven't looked too much into it.
there's a great book by, and I realize he's a little bit of a normie figure, but that being said, I haven't found a convincing argument against him. That Thomas Sowell wrote in the 80s, and it was called Civil Rights and Narrative.
I was going to
And the
mention
point of
Thomas
it was
Sowell, yes.
essentially 20 years after the Civil Rights Revolution, he was basically looking at it and he was like, well, did it work? And it was interesting because he grew up in essentially like a working class black family in Harlem, which is to a certain degree kind of an oxymoron now. But his essential point was like, not only has this not worked, it demolished what forward progress had been made. And so, look, I'm not going to try and get into the argument of like, oh, well, would things be perfect? Like, would essentially the black community have transformed into,
Right.
like cheery, happy, like essentially like, a Mayberry style, like Andy Griffith community? I'm not really interested in getting to that. But I think we could say that almost unequivocally, it would have been better. I mean,
I think the big thing is that it's sort of, in a weird way, it destroyed their chance at building their own culture, which is why, Kanye is talking about Nike and the Gap, which, isn't black by any, measurable metric, right? But
Well,
that's what they worship now.
Because, and I think that Dave, the distributist, was right about this when he basically said that, like, say what you will about the real origins of jazz, but if jazz is black culture, it's kind of the pinnacle of black culture. And I think that you could say the same thing about jazz and also kind of like other parts of the Harlem Renaissance. Like one of my favorite novels is The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, I believe. And it's a very well written novel, and I don't mean to say that to come across as some kind of like, like soft shit lib, but you don't see anything coming out that's that introspective anymore, and that kind of flame of culture has been kind of just smothered in its crib. And this is a broader point that I like to speak on because I lived in the ghetto, for a year. My girlfriend worked at a terrible school. She was a teacher there. And my point is not like, look, these aren't my people. It's not my job to fix them, quote unquote. But there is something to be said that, like, I think it's all too easy to look at kind of the advantages, quote unquote, that the black community gets from being a client group, which is like the ability to, violate laws, the ability to have, a lot of welfare. And like in a raw economic sense, those are benefits, right? Like they get free stuff. But that is not the type of life you want. And if your entire vision is to essentially set up a system where there's just Gibbs for white people, like you're going to see the same type of degradation.
It's not a stable sort of strata of society, right?
It's not something to emulate in any way.
It's perfectly said. I mean, because their community is just a complete ruin. And if you ask the question, I mean, would you have the roles reversed, right? If you just reverse the roles of white people and black people, I think most people would just say no. Even some of like the more hardcore, like Wignat and white nationalist types, I don't think anybody wants to be in their position, even though they get the Gibbs. The Gibbs, it's kind of just like a pacifier in a sense.
Right. Yeah. It's a pacifier, and and sorry, I realize this is a delicate topic, so if I'm hesitating, it's because it's for the sake of the channel.
Sure. Yeah, I'm trying myself to limit the Fed posting.
Especially in the South, right? There has pretty much always been a black minority, and there have been times when relationships have gone much, much better than they go now. And kind of the current system seems to be in no one's best interest. And I'm not saying that, look, like 100 years ago, we had this idyllic system but at the very least, it was at least possible to kind of keep to your own, and to have kind of like
I saw
side
a screenshot on Twitter today that was, it was meant as a joke. It was a melanin-enriched gentleman taking a photo of himself, and the text said, "We used to have bathrooms and culture to ourselves, and what did we give it up for?"
Well, actually, there's a really interesting, like, specific version of this, which is funeral homes. That there used to be essentially like all white and all black funeral homes. And essentially what happened is there are still some, and they're just geographic and they're owned by families. But essentially post desegregation, they're started to become these like massive like funeral home conglomerates, who essentially just bought out all of these, smaller homes because the client base kind of dried up, because instead of being like, oh, this is my black neighborhood's funeral home, run by a guy who lives here, now it's essentially like Funeral Corp who comes in and has 100 of these all across your state. And I think that obviously like you see the worst and the most like ugly versions of kind of like pre-civil rights America in the black and white photos. And I'm not going to deny that, right? Like there's always like racial strife and racial conflict, but a lot of those parallel institutions were also the institutions providing any type of like tie to your society. And when those are broken down and outside forces move in, I mean, people don't respect those. That's what you saw a lot in the 90s, right? With the Rodney King riots, that essentially like when out groups, so like the Koreans owned the stores, the people who lived there didn't respect them. And I'm realizing there's a lot of other issues there as well, but it's just, something to keep in mind.
No, it's very well put. I mean, as soon as you get rid of any of these type of localized in-group communities, and you bring in the universalization, then you just get conglomerates. Basically, that's kind of how the economy is structured. The economy favors that model over like this kind of universalized, low margin, like country spanning global type.
I'm going to fight you on this, and I'm sorry, Jay, to drag this all back into a thing that's been going on, but I don't think that is just the economy. It is a culture or a people or a spirit that actually sort of, never gives up, never stops. And that may be a foreign entity to the US, but it's certainly a foreign entity to the EU. We don't operate on that level, that conglomeration.
You don't? I mean, forgive me, but don't you have this problem where essentially a lot of like smaller nations, like specifically in Eastern Europe, have a large amount of their economy essentially owned by like French and German like mega conglomerates?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure. We do it now, right? But it's not part of us.
Right,
it's not a natural part of us.
I see your distinction.
Yeah.
I guess you could make that case that it's not a part of the kind of traditional culture, but it really is something when like the universal 90s liberalism kicks in, and it's just all of these other cultures are buried, then what is left is really consolidation of industry, right? That's kind of what culture becomes inevitably. It's just that's kind of like the superior model of how to, and I don't mean it in a cultural sense, but in a sort of economic sense, having these very standardized businesses that operate on franchises that are kind of global or national. But I mean, it's neither here nor there. I'm not good. I didn't want to make that into a sort of argument.
Yeah, so we're getting a bit off topic here.
Yeah, sorry, I really pulled us off the whole Kanye conversation.
No, it's very interesting, and not Fed posting is hard here. But it's important to remember that I didn't ever believe that Kanye was our guy, and I'm not about to start believing it now. But as Ludwig says, if the ball's flying into our court and none of the people who say they're on my team are running for it, then at least I have a metric to use to know who's actually on my team.
That's well said. I think that's pretty much my take on this situation as well.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement. Maybe we can start looking at King of the Hill.
Yeah, let's get into why we're actually here. It's only been 30 minutes of stalling. Okay, why don't you kick it off, Ludwig, with some of the background and the idea of the show.
So yeah, King of the Hill is one of the longest running cartoon sitcoms, I think, in the history of like any show ever. It started in the 90s and ended in the 2010s at some point. So it's created by Mike Judge, who's also the creator of shows like Beavis and Butthead. I think many people know Office Space. Bill Lundberg, there's a very sort of iconic character. Idiocracy, he's created Silicon Valley. Let's just go off the list here. As The Good Family, that I wasn't that particularly a fan of. Am I missing something, Jay?
Silicon Valley is fantastic if you work in tech, by the way.
mean, I like almost everything that Mike Judge has produced, and part of the reason is that he is a bit of an outsider in the this kind of Hollywood show business game, where he is. He was born in New Mexico, and he has a sort of a background as a physics major who went into a type of engineering job and then just did animation on the side, and was able to get featured on some of these film festivals with some simple animation that ended up becoming Office Space and these other shows. And like I to be honest, a little bit in the spirit of the against ideology video from AA, like the reason that he is, I think he is better than a lot of the people in show business, is that he's not one of them. Like, and I think people know what I mean.
Right.
With that, he's not a Leibowitz. Basically, he's an actual
Irish or something. Isn't he?
Actually, sort of Caucasian, like white, as you would say, American, and he has that perspective, like more of that kind of white middle class perspective on the world, and he's able to write white characters in a way that's much better than most of these the people who are in Hollywood, who will either, because of resentment, they will write white characters as just being stupid or like completely incomprehensible. I mean, in particular, like white male characters who are portrayed as being, let's say, like rural, if they're from the Bible Belt or the Rust Belt or something like that, they're always going to be portrayed as being kind of stupid and having these absolutely kind of insidious personalities. Or if they're like very left wing, they simply don't. I mean, look, you look at the research from Jonathan Haidt, they simply won't have the capacity to even understand people who are on the opposite end of the political spectrum, right?
Yeah.
So, but this guy is very much, he's different from that, and that's why he can write characters, say like Hank Hill and his friends, who are actually sympathetic, Texans, right?
That being said, it's interesting that he's been able to survive for as long as he has. Given,
well, he's remained completely apolitical, right? He doesn't want to talk about his politics in public, and he's very if he has a power level, then he hides it, right? I think he understands that if he wants to be able to continue making animation and writing films and so on, he has to kind of shut up about what he believes and just try to
kind of like South Park has done.
Yeah, do this kind of like
fire at everyone and never show up to interviews, so no one can take you on anything.
Well,
always do.
Interesting, because there's a subgenre of, because I actually looked this up because I was curious if he made any comments on politics, and there's a whole subgenre of like bottom feeding journalists who are essentially trying to read in politics to King of the Hill, and they're kind of like doing like, oh, is King of the Hill really a conservative show? And so there's like a whole
like a soundbite, yeah. Oh. Did we lose you?
I wonder if he fell over or something. But
all right,
that would be interesting.
Hopefully he's okay.
Yeah. So that's but I mean, reading into we'll get into that as well, like the politics of King of the Hill, and of course I have to say that like this is a conservative show. Mike Judge will deny it's a conservative show. I mean, he said that like this is a populist show. He said that along with Greg Daniels, who's like the co-creator. Which in reality, Greg Daniels is not really the co-creator. He's produced the show, and he added a couple of characters, like Luann Platter is there, like Hank Hill's father, Cotton, being the way that he is, and the fact that like Dale Gribble is like a cuckold was basically that's the contribution of Greg Daniels with a sort of an asterisk at the end, right? I mean, his Wikipedia doesn't outright confirm that he is in the tribe, but it's sort of like Leibowitz. He's married into like it's just Leibowitz all over the place. If you look at his connections, right. And he's been like this kind of New York writer most of his life, so you kind of see where that's going. So I think a lot of the more subversive add-ons that needed to be in this show for it to be accepted by the higher ups in like the Fox network and so on were contributed by Greg Daniels, but like the actual heart, in my view, like the conservative heart of this show is from Mike Judge. And like I said, he's just said that this is just a populist show about common sense, and that's something we'll get into. But in my view, if you make a show that presents both sides equally and you present conservative characters as being humane, reasonable, and being likable and having understandable motivations, that is sort of de facto, in the world we live, a conservative show. Do you agree?
I agree. Anything true is right wing.
That's well said, and I think too it is because I was talking to my roommate about this, and he's a casual fan of the show, and also has a more rural background than mine. Like I'm pretty middle class American, and what he was saying is it's probably the last show chronologically he can think of that portrays like middle America or rural America in a positive light. And so whereas that might not have been, at the start of its run, a necessarily political statement, by virtue of those people becoming, the quote unquote deplorable class, I think it has become politicized. And I realize that sounds like awful, like, BuzzFeed talk, but I think it's true. There's something like, much like you said, like, because it is true and it speaks well of a certain demographic and a certain kind of like political block, it is almost de facto become political, and by that I mean conservative.
Right.
I also think the show was kind of lucky to end in 2010, right? Because things just got worse. A lot of people talk about how they want King of the Hill to come back on the air and stuff. I feel like those people don't understand like any of the subtext going into this show, and looking at how the show would have to because this show has always been very topical, right?
I was going to say, yeah. I can't imagine hearing Hank saying something like, "Now, what the hell is the Gamergate?"
Yeah, I mean, that the arc would have to be like Bobby moves out of the house and becomes transgender, and then Hank becomes a Q-tard or something, and he shows up on January the 6th. I feel like that kind of an arc would have been inescapable for reasons that I'll get into later, in terms of how like the kind of the spirit of the character Hank Hill is created.
Well,
just a few. Yeah.
And you hear this a lot when people talk about like comedy, like, oh, you couldn't get away with this now. I think you really could not get away with this show now. And I don't mean to say that in like, oh, like things were so good in the 90s, like you could say anything. But I mean, the joke of a character like Dale Gribble, like that character is no longer, at least in American society, like a stock joke, like, oh, you're crazy uncle who talks too much about politics. Like, that is a insurrectionist, that's a domestic terrorist. And so I think that the things like that would have been kind of too problematic, quote unquote, to continue.
Yeah, it's very well said. And I think that, the trajectory for most of these characters in this show would have gone the same way, into the point that they would have either been insurrectionists directly or sympathetic towards that worldview. But I mean, looking at some of these, some of the labels here on the bullet board, I came to think about like Arlene. That's the town that this is set in. That's like a fictional Texan town. That's sort of it's based on Austin, I think, Austin, Texas.
Arlen, Texas. Yeah.
I mean, what do you think of that, Jay Burton? Because I don't know if you spent much time in Texas, but do you think like this is a good depiction of what life is like in Austin?
So I live roughly 2,000 miles away from Texas. I have been to Texas several times, and I've driven through it multiple times. I've only flown into it once. And I would say, like, from my interactions with, people on the side of the road and at gas stations and people I know, it holds up. Obviously, I don't live there. But to me, like, that kind of, it is very identifiably, at least to me, I think, East Texas. It feels very real. And I believe that Mike Judge is from New Mexico, so a little bit further away, but like in the same, kind of like Southwest area. And to me, it seems very true to life. Obviously, I don't live there, but it was very identifiable to me.
Lumberg, real quick in the chat here, wants us to discuss Office Space. I'll say that Office Space is probably my favorite thing that Mike Judge has made. It's the I feel like it's a this might land me in hot water with the film buffs, but I feel like the Office Space is a cultural co-movie to The Big Lebowski.
I've
If
never
that
heard that
means
take
anything to
before.
you.
Actually, I'll process that tonight.
Yeah.
I
See how I
actually
feel about it.
I fully believe it. So my dad is my reference for this because he was kind of coming of age in the mid to late 90s. And so when I think of kind of like the Mike Judge Mike Judge creations that I have the most relation to, that's one of them. And watching that with my dad and watching like his other favorite movies, The Big Lebowski, both of those were linked in his mind. So I feel like you could find some kind of, I guess, like some kind of productive discussion there.
Yeah, it's one of those. They're both. I mean, it's in multiple ways. Maybe this is an entire stream. Take a chug, everyone in the chat. By the way, but I mean, not just in structure, but also in a lot of the. There's something about that '90s feeling of out of time sort of thing. I don't know. I can't put my finger on it. It's just in my head. These two movies sort of fit together as they form.
I think
They form
a lot of the
a complete thesis together.
the theme of
But I
those
can't
movies,
tell you
like,
what that is.
what's that line from Blink 182? Like, work sucks, I know. Like the that is kind of the essence of it. That a lot of these standard middle class jobs, they just completely suck, and you should just try to get out of it while you can. And it's very Gen X-y.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think that The Big Lebowski is the self-conception of Gen X, and Office Space
yeah.
is the reality of Gen X.
Yeah, that might work. Yeah, that might be it. And they're both also movies that are kind of on the trajectory of a lot happens, but nothing happens as well. Like nothing really changes, except in Office Space he gets a lot of money, but he doesn't change really. There's no character development. No one changes
sure?
things. I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
I mean, how I remember Office Space is that the main character is like stuck in this office job for this financial tech company with
and then he
girlfriend
ends
that he
up
doesn't
stealing
like.
money from them, right?
But
And then he's like, I'm going to go live my life now.
He is sort of hypnotized in this kind of therapy session that he goes to with his girlfriend, and then ends up like breaking off with his girlfriend to try to live the life that he has. I mean, in my opinion, that he had character development, so he decided to sort of quit doing the sort of middle class desk job to go do manual labor and just kind of try to enjoy the moment instead of trying to chase something that somebody else told him to do. I mean, it's a pretty standard,
yeah, okay,
movie
sure, I'll
plots.
buy it. Yeah.
And I mean, they burned down the entire building at the end, so I mean, something did happen in Office Space.
No, I'm not saying nothing happens, right? I'm saying that the character doesn't change. I mean, he's the same guy at the end of it. He's just stolen a bunch of money.
Well, yeah, I thought it was wow.
This is a totally different topic. Let's get back to King of the Hill.
Okay, yeah, certainly. So yeah, we'll do Office Space another time. So I put in a little image there from Idiocracy as well. I mean, we talk about movies that couldn't be made today and Mike Judge properties, because this is, I mean, it is basically a movie about eugenics, right? And I've seen a lot of these like progressive YouTube reviewers deriding this film as like, oh, it's such a bad film, not only because of the humor, but because of some of the implications of how eugenics works and so on. And of course, he doesn't want to talk about politics, but you can see a lot of it's coming through in this movie and the kind of choices that Mike Judge chose to make in Idiocracy with the kind of the demographic shift and some of the things that have happened in this 500 years in the future where the IQ has been cut in half.
Well, it's interesting. The thing about Idiocracy is that when Idiocracy, I think, came out, it was kind of if not by like Mike Judge's action, by kind of like society viewed as a liberal movie, kind of like rolled into kind of like a lot of the anti-Bush attitudes of like, oh, like, like racist redneck Americans, to the point that a lot of the like kind of like shit lib Gen Xers I know still kind of love that movie. But I think that as it has aged, it has become it's become harder and harder to kind of like marry that with like actual like IRL shit lib politics, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just I absolutely love this movie. I know a lot of people think it has like stupid humor, but there's just a lot of these decisions that he made, like having the demographic be like, the United States is like 50%, trailer redneck, 50% Mexican immigrant. I was thinking back at one of these essays that the Prudentialist put on Substack about the snoo snoo. I think you linked it to me, Walrus, like the kind of shape of women now, where but it seems like all of the women are really large, and the men have become like these sort of small, twiggy men, and how that kind of reflects the new gender dynamic. And that it kind of made me think about this movie a little bit, because there's this there's a scene where they're doing the rehabilitation, quote unquote, where the main character is kind of like set to be in this coliseum and drive around this car to be kind of run over by these larger, like gladiator type vehicles, and they bring in this character that's called Beef Supreme. That's like this main gladiator superhero guy, right? And he's also supposed to be a heartthrob, so he sort of like plays to the audience and he winks at the audience, and then the camera pans over to the audience to see like the women who are kind of swooning over him, and like all of the women are like these fat Mexican women.
Yeah.
And it's just like it I feel like it just says so much about how he thinks the future would be, and how like spot on it's been in terms of the demographic development. So yeah, Idiocracy stream in the future. Take a drink.
Hey, get ready,
take a drink
Zoomers.
for
You
that
can be
one.
boy toy to fat women. That's your future.
Perfect. Right, but if we flip the slide, so we can get more into the characters.
Yeah, let's do that. Now, we have the hills here, and I put out a poll about 15 minutes ago asking, is Hank Hill based? And it's sitting at about 60% yes, 40% no in the chat. So, what do you guys think?
Jay can go first.
Maybe we'll assert that at the end once we get through all of it.
I actually think so. I'm going to go with yes on this, and I'll preempt I think that a lot of the no's are basically like, oh, like he's propositional nation, like America, kind of like
the grill pill, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that puts Hank Hill from 1997 and places him in the world of 2023. Like this is fundamentally like part of what's so attractive about it is it really is about a different world. It is pre-Obama America. And that was a really different world. Like I remember it well. I kind of grew up in it. And so like to me, the people like Hank Hill that I know are that I would say they kind of fall into the type of people who shouldn't have to be political, kind of like the normal everyday Joes who really don't have anything to do with politics, who work kind of like real jobs. And I think that it's like this weird mental illness to demand that everything you like and every person you like essentially like regurgitate your like esoteric right. And I'm not saying you guys, but you're like esoteric right politics. And so to me, like, and maybe this is me getting a little over emotional about it, because I know like half a dozen guys who are just Hank Hill, which is part of the reason I love this show so much. But to me, those are the kind of like good people who should be like in an ideal world thriving and unconcerned with politics. And I think that this show kind of shows a window into a time when they could still do that.
And nowadays, Hank Hill would have to have a position on, Gamergate and January 6th, as we talked about earlier, and that just wouldn't work.
He would be listening to Rush Limbaugh and posting Facebook memes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm just gonna give my take really quickly. I think you did a very nice job covering a lot of my sentiments, Jay. But I mean, the reason this character is controversial in the DR, and he is controversial in the DR. I mean, I know that Academic Agents had requests for covering King of the Hill, and he's basically refused on account of like Hank Hill being a boomer truther, right? I remember at the Skildings event, Walrus, where we were talking about to the people who were there, and I talked to some of them who were there last year, and how there had been a speech talking about how like Hank Hill is the model, citizen for us to emulate, and that had turned into like this big shouting match and controversy. I wish I was there last year for that. It would have been it would have been great just to be a fly on the wall to see it. And of course, I've taken a few notes here just to list kind of, okay, what are the points, like when people talk about Hank Hill being a boomer truther, what are the points kind of against Hank Hill? And it's really about like him having drunk the Kool-Aid on the kind of civil rights, progressive civil rights values, right? We talk about the Martin Luther King type. It's not about the color of her skin, but the content of her character. And he repeats that line in the show many times. There's an episode in the show where he's sort of concerned that like his dog has become racist because of him, right? Because he has like a black repairman in to check his hot water tank, and like his dog attacks the repairman, and because he's black, then there's like this big drama that comes out of that, where everybody thinks that Hank is racist, and he has to like bend over backwards to prove that he doesn't care about race, he's colorblind, and he's eventually able to prove that, right? So he keeps just kind of harking back to these truths, even though I think he's, you'd think that he's old enough to remember schools being desegregated, like when he was alive. But of course, Hank's age is disputed because he was like, according to the executives, he's actually supposed to be 32 years old in the show. But that's only something they did on account of that being like the perfect viewer age for the Fox News viewers at the sort of the Fox viewers at the time. But I mean, in reality, this guy can't be 32. Like, he has to be like at least like 40 plus, like early 50 something. And of course, that's the kind of points against, okay, why is Hank not based? Because he keeps kind of clinging on to this center right, boomer con colorblindness. But I will put like the point in his favor why he is based, because the writers on King of the Hill, they were basically instructed to read a book by Philip K. Howard. That's like this lawyer type that's called The Death of Common Sense. And they were just basically told by Mike Judge that like The Death of Common Sense is the book that's going to kind of like define the spirit of the project of Hank Hill in the show. And what that book is about is really, not in the language that we use, but if you apply the language of, say, James Burnham to the content of that book, it's really about like how the United States is becoming gradually more managerialized through the legal system, and how like everything has to be processed through some court, even if it's something as stupid as like two mothers disagreeing about what kids should be on the swing, right? It's like everybody has to be litigious, everything has to go to the court, and everybody's suing everybody else. And they think that the courts are like some kind of supercomputer, perfect software program that's just going to solve all of their problems, where it's not actually possible to make sovereign decisions as an individual, or to use common sense to solve problems. Where he's, the author is sort of advocating for like, we need to sort of try to break down some of these laws and start going back to just having the individual make the decisions for themselves. Which that is something that is inherently based, but it doesn't stop there, because, okay, this book was released, I think, in the 90s, but this author has continued to sort of release things up until 2001, where he released a paper, like this legal paper that's it's called Progressivism Leads to Paralysis, or something like that, where he just argues that all of these problems that he talks about, the kind of over litigiousness about Americans, it comes from like this sort of progressive worldview and the progressive politics going back to FDR. So in my view, that means that like the arc of Hank Hill, if he's alive to 2001, is basically to this kind of Christopher Caldwell age of entitlement, like actually understanding that progressivism is actually bad, and taking more of this kind of nuanced dissident perspective. And I don't know what you think of that, but like that's my argument for why I think like Hank Hill is actually kind of based.
I think you're at least very, very spot on in the sort of analysis of the character, and I think some of the the dynamic that makes the show good comes largely from Hank being, in like 90% of the situations, he's the straight man, and he's also the main character, which is unusual for these types of shows. And I was going to say it, but Nordhuger in the chat basically beat me to it. He says he's a good-hearted medieval peasant who's been thrust into techno-modernity and is over his head, but he's trying his best. And I think that flows well with your idea of common sense logic, that we live in a society today that requires a lot more from people who do not have either the want or the faculties to care about it or make those decisions. And, we made it everyone's business.
Exactly, and like you said, Hank he's more of like this kind of working peasant type, where he doesn't have the big picture thinking that's required to think about like geopolitics or any larger ideas regarding it. All he can do is try to keep the barbarians at bay, like try to keep order, and that is like most of the episodes in King of the Hill. It's some type of conflict where Hank has to try to maintain order against the kind of progressive pause that just keeps floating to the surface. I mean, just as an example, there's Hank Hill works at Strickland Propane, and there's an episode where he has to hire a new employee because they lack manpower. And Hank doesn't, he gets several applicants, and he gets a qualified female applicant that he doesn't want to hire because she's too attractive. And he's sort of afraid that he's gonna cheat on his wife, or he's gonna be tempted because they would develop some type of office romance. So he chooses to hire the male applicant instead. But of course, the applicant is a drug addict, right? He's like this completely useless, addicted guy who just makes a mess of things in the office. And then so he has to turn around and try to fire the guy, and that would be the common sense approach. Okay, we hired this guy by mistake. He doesn't belong here. He can't do a good job, so we have to fire him. But then, like one of these, bureaucrats, that's Anthony Page, the kind of redhead glasses social worker guy, comes in and says that, well, I mean, if the company has more than 10 employees, then you're subject to a different type of laws, and you have to do this and this, and you can't actually fire the guy because there's all these civil rights that are protecting him and so on. So they have to hold on to this kind of like drug addict employee that can't do anything because of the laws. And that's where you get the perspective, like the common sense against the kind of encroaching managerial law structure that he's always fighting against in this show.
Well, I think that one of the other things that we kind of talk about in these circles is essentially that there are things that you kind of need to have on a cultural level that aren't rational, that are kind of pre-rational, and you don't really want to or need to get into the weeds of kind of defining them. And specifically,
I'll quote the rug merchant here and say that civilization is indescribable.
Well, yeah, I agree. And one of the things that is a constant running joke, because admittedly it is a funny thing, and I know people like this. There's a kind of a trend of middle Americans who are so prudish that they essentially cannot even say like anatomical terms. There's an early episode where Peggy Hill has to teach a class,
like fool herself into saying
right. And you see the same thing continually with Hank Hill and Luann, where he's like so focused on being proper that he gets mad at her for dressing immodestly around the house or putting their laundry in the same hamper, which is on one hand like kind of silly, right? And it's played as a joke, but that kind of like deep.
One of the greatest early jokes is, I think it's when he has to go after his mother for something. Like his mother has like ran off with like an RV or something, and Bobby wants to come along, but then he like taps him on the shoulder, like holds him on the shoulder and says, "No, son, tomorrow is garbage day." And then Bobby gets this like duty look in his eyes and does almost like he's like seconds away from giving him like a salute, because he understands that I have to take out the trash, I have to be the man of the house when you're gone. And it's this sort of approach to your surroundings that is required to build a society, right?
Well, and I think that that's a big like part of the comedy is that essentially even in the 90s, the 2000s, Hank Hill is kind of a man outside of time. Like that is he is not necessarily a good fit for society, which is why his prudishness is a joke, because it's funny. It's like he doesn't really match the rest of society. But I think that is an admirable trait if we consider ourselves like traditionalists or reactionaries in any sense.
Yes, because his prudishness cannot be explained by some kind of inherited tradition. Like you have the picture there where he has like, his father Cotton Hill and his mother, and like his mother is this sort of traveling, like globe-trotting hippie, and his father is kind of a degenerate in his own way. Like he's very, I guess, old school in this kind of masculine sense, but he's not prudish, or he's not a proper person in the same way Hank is. So he is, like you said, a man out of time, and this also makes him like one of the best straight men ever, like in a comedy where he's like the straight man and the clown is like the entire United States. Basically, that's how I feel about this show. And like, I mean, not only because he is a straight man, but kind of what Hank's position is. Like when you go into this situation, he doesn't have to say like, okay, this is how I feel about nudity, and this is how I feel about swear words, this is how I feel about burning the flag, or feel about like gender bending and stuff. You always know where you have Hank. There's no surprises with him, and you're also kind of allowed to laugh at him because he is the kind of white man character. So you couldn't have done this the other way, where you have like some kind of like shit-lib character who has progressive beliefs, and you kind of first of all, you don't know what their beliefs are because they change constantly, and second of all, like there's certain things you just can't laugh at. And
that was literally tried in the show that killed this one, Cleveland Brown, or what he's called, the Family Guy people who made like a spin-off, and that didn't last long. So
yeah, that might be true. I'd never watched Cleveland.
I haven't watched all of it. I've just watched like 2 episodes, and then I figured, no, this is boring.
But yeah, the straight man and the comedy from the straight man, it has to almost come from this conservative perspective. It cannot be liberal. It cannot be leftist in any way. Like leftist humor you could get from some, say, transgression, for instance, and it would be transgressing against people like Hank Hill in positions of power. Like say someone like Seth Rogen, where it's like the only joke that he has is like, dude, weed Lamau, but if weed is institutionalized and it's sold to you at all of these dispensaries, and it's just kind of a normal part of life, like buying painkillers, there's nothing transgressive about it. So I think, that was just my point, that this guy's just such a great comedic character as well, because of his disposition.
There's a famous clip from it, actually. This dovetails both with kind of the weed conversation, and like one of the other things that I like about this show is it is fundamentally, like anti-government and anti-bureaucracy. Is this this interaction where Hank Hill has found some type of like Indian artifact, and so has gone to a thinly veiled University of Austin to go talk with a local expert, and he's confronted on campus by a guy with a list of signatures asking Hank Hill to sign to decriminalize hemp. And he sells it to Hank Hill by saying like, oh, like it's government overreach. They're trying to prevent us from making good rope. And Hank is like, oh, well, of course, like I want the government out of my life. And then after he signs it, of course, the pothead reveals like, oh, and you can smoke it like marijuana. And, he's horrified by this. And so like, obviously there's a joke in that, like it's comedy, but that does speak to kind of another thing that is very like kind of inherently conservative about the show, that it is, both it has like a relatively negative view of weed, which was at the time kind of on the very much kind of like you said about Rogan, like being like injected into the culture, but also is very much kind of anti-bureaucracy in a very kind of like honest and I think fundamentally American way.
All up until the later seasons as well. I remember there's one episode with this like diversity guy coming into Bobby's school and sort of like grifting himself into, oh, you need to do a diversity check on your school, right? Even though the school has like literally no metric problems that they can really be held accountable for. Everything looks fine, but like, oh, what's your diversity rate? It's 42. That's good, but that means it's they're going to start killing each other. Or something. And he's like, look at that group of diverse kids, it's just a powder keg waiting to blow. And it ends with, of course, Hank telling Bobby that you can't be an SJW, because that's basically what he turns into. You have to find a middle ground, I guess, is what he advocates for. You have to like focus on just being a good guy and get your work done, really.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely great, and it's another example of this kind of like legal absurdism, or this, this government, like the war on racism and the war on this and the war on that, that comes in, and they just find problems where none exists. They keep ramping up more of this legalist stuff. I mean, it's another reason that I like this show, is that it actually you can learn a lot about the United States watching it, because the stuff that's happening, it's not just stuff that they made up. For the episodes, it usually reflects something that's been in the papers, or stuff that's happened. So that if say you have an episode from like 2001, and there's something about, I don't remember if it was 2001, but there's one episode I think about soda machines being put into elementary schools, making the kids fat. And like I looked it up, and that this is something that actually happened, right? This is I mean, you could probably back me up on this, Jay Burden. Like,
yeah, it's funny. I actually remember that very distinctly, because that was when I would have been in elementary school, and I very much remember that it was. And this actually, a lot of this happened under first term Obama, because one of the big things that Michelle did was, I can't remember the name of it, but it was everywhere. When I was right at the target age, was trying to essentially like make kids healthy, and so it was a big push.
We had Jamie Oliver over here being the front face for that. It was pretty much the same thing.
Another prominent male figure, but
yes.
Sorry, the Michelle Obama is a man memes are like deeply.
They're great.
But
I love them.
Yeah, so I remember that. That's odd that you bring that up, because I hadn't seen that episode, but that was something I experienced, firsthand.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, yeah, I just love that stuff, that you can just learn so much in terms of what's actually going on there, because it really lends an element of groundedness to the show that you don't have in other shows, where it's all in the author's head, and it's all about like the author's feelings, and whatever happens has to be dictated by this sort of narrative. Where here it's like there is sort of a world that exists that they're reacting to, and that creates a lot of the great the great comedy and like the great conflicts in the show. But we've talked a lot about Hank Hill, that I think we're gonna have to comment a little bit on his family as well. Yeah. So which one do we want to do? Like Peggy, Bobby, Cotton?
Let's do Bobby first, because I think he has the most sort of interaction. I mean, opposition to Hank, in that he, it's that boy in right line that he says. In that he's very much not like his father. He's a lot more, well, I guess effeminate is the word to use.
Yeah, he's extremely kind of a quirky kid. So I have a quote here from Mike Judge. He says, quote, "I was trying to capture the kind of kid who is capable of sitting on the couch expressionless for hours and hours," end quote. And quote, "the kind of kid who sits and wears a t-shirt at a public swimming pool." Right. So he is just supposed to reflect another kind of American archetype of kids, even though he's sort of it's very much about like the difficulties of having a kid who doesn't live up to the expectations, where like you have both the Peggy and Hank, who are quite in their own ways very athletic, outgoing people, and Bobby, who's only interested in like sitting inside watching television, eating food.
How did you get an F in English, Bobby? You speak English. Yeah, that's one of the great quotes I remember. Sorry.
But it's also, revealed like in the show that Bobby has a lot of hidden talents, right? And they don't really know, like from the more kind of square perspective of Hank Hill, he doesn't really know how to capitalize, or what do you do if you're like your son is like this kind of chubby boy who's like a very good dancer, or like very good at like playing chess or doing quizzes or something. It's so it's like this mismatch of expectations between father and son. I guess the only like possible point they could have had a reconciliation is like.
Hang on a moment. Sorry. Ashurvad Gutam in chat is saying, "Is this a gaming channel?"
Yes, it is.
And the game, yes, it is. And the game is to figure out what our political position is.
That's perfect.
Go back.
Yeah. Well. All right. Yeah. We got Walrus Gaming tonight. So
There
like
are
with
rumors of Walrus gaming happening at certain late hours. If you're a keen-eyed viewer, you might have spotted
in
some
the
Walrus
midnight
gaming.
hour, when the moon shines high, and there's with the
Exactly.
with the little glimpse in your eye, you look around the corner and and
Yeah.
there you find the Walrus gaming. Yeah, I mean, one of the funnier episodes I think with Bobby is the episode where they figure out that Bobby is kind of a crack shot, and this is something that you'd think that they could bond over, right? Shooting guns, which is sort of very quintessentially American thing, and not just American, but also a Texan thing. But I mean, the comedy there is that actually Hank is scared of guns, which is which makes it even worse, right? So
Well, I guess it's more that Hank respects guns more than Bobby does.
Yeah, but
Feels like
I think in the episode they show that he's not very good at shooting, so he has to like pay like this kind of hypnotist guy to
the
help
sports
him with
coach
sports
or something,
performance.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just kind of it's kind of left there, but you do see that there are plenty of opportunities where they could potentially bond, but they like this tension or like this conflict where they just can't find anything to agree on, and they just keep living in these separate universes while at the same time trying to meet each other. It's I mean, yeah, it creates a lot of good comedy. I don't know, Jay, do you have any thoughts on Bobby?
So I actually, and this will be a common refrain, I growing up knew several kids who were essentially Bobby Hill. Like it's a very common, I guess, like type of kid. And even to the point that my roommate's younger brother is kind of a similar archetype. And his dad, being of the kind of like Hank Hill demographic, that pairing is a pretty common one. And whereas in the early 90s, I think it was, Bobby Hill was definitely like Judge described, like sitting on the couch watching television. I think you see it now kind of on the internet, so people my age who are kind of like raised by the algorithm can have a very difficult time relating to kind of their older Gen X, younger baby boomer parents who are, people like Hank Hill, like very analog kind of real world people. And so you see that breakdown quite commonly. And I think especially when it's across a kind of, like, and I don't mean to say class in the sense of like how much they're paid, but class in the sense of education divide. So for a lot of people, like as college degrees have gotten more common, whereas their parents might have been high school graduates or trade school graduates and worked kind of blue collar jobs, like selling propane or, farming, things like that. Their children, even as adults, if they went to school or have more kind of like digital careers, you see that same breakdown. And so it really is describing a pretty big disconnect in kind of like rural and suburban America. And there are a lot of people, even if they're not like literal Bobby Hills, in the sense of like a pathetic, like, kind of comedic fat child, they were that kid in 1997, and so it really, again, is describing something very real.
I was going to say Bobby, would be, well, not me, but me in the sense that Bobby would grow up to watch cooking videos on YouTube, to learn how to do things, while Hank sort of just, he tried desperately to get him to only grill. Not that I don't grill, but it's one of those things where, you get the millennials these days are more intellectual and unable to apply that common sense to real life situations that sort of is ingrained in Hank, and that's sort of what Bobby lacks.
Yeah, that's actually very well put. So yeah, it's a nice description of like the divide between like the kid and the parent. Even though with Bobby they don't get the internet until a little bit later in the seasons, but I guess it's the television then and the magazines.
I mean, he's frequently punished for stuff he does by like being told to go watch TV or something. Yeah.
But then like the other question is like the Bobby, I guess not the physiognomy, but the physique. Why is he so fat? Is it because of like the corn syrup and the processed food, or is it because like there's some habit of trying to bribe children with sweets and so on? What do you think, Jay?
I mean, it's hard to say. At least in my experience, I never really saw like food being used as as like a bribe by parents. It probably happened. I just never saw it. But what you saw happen is that, and one of my favorite authors is an American by the name of Wendell Berry. He has written a lot of fiction and a lot of kind of philosophy as well. Most famous for a short essay, "Why I Will Never Own a Computer," which is worth your time. It's like 3 pages. But he describes in some of his fiction, which kind of describes kind of like rural America. What he talks about is that there were kind of like patterns in rural America that were like kind of developed to fit a different time and place. So specifically, right, like during the Depression, a lot of rural Americans were hungry often. And so they kind of developed this relationship to food where you ate as much as you could get. So I see this in my grandpa, right? He's an older guy. He was raised by children of the Depression. And then this attitude that like, no matter what, you clean your plate, you don't leave anything to waste. And, when kind of food quality in America was higher and food was more expensive, like you could kind of get away with having a certain relationship to food, but as the food in America has gotten so cheap and so unhealthy that a lot of people who essentially used to just eat until they were full, but it was real food. And so fair enough. Like maybe if you looked at working class guys in the 70s, they might've had a little bit of a beer gut and they might've been a little bit overweight, but that relationship to food where now food is like an active choice where you have to say like enough is enough. Like a lot of those people just never had to act that way towards food. And so that's where I think you see a lot of the like massive obesity in rural America. And I'm not going to say that's what Bobby represents, but there a lot of the
it gets to the point where it's that what's it called, like second, you have third world and then you have second world, like you see South America where the bad food is cheap, so if you're poor you're overweight basically.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think that there's this kind of like idea that the bribe paid to the American middle class and American working class was essentially, it was cheapness and quantity, so like, oh, you can now buy, what would have been luxuries when you were a kid, you can buy like a cheap knockoff version of that for 1/10 of what it used to cost. And so whereas, and I know a lot of people like this, they're the kind of like tradition of frugality, that was like, oh, you're always hunting for a deal, that made a lot of sense when there was a lot more material privation. Now that leads you down the line of essentially, and this is what like one of the other great like things in, King of the Hill is Megalomart, right? That leads you to these like big box stores where you can buy essentially like mass produced, Chinese crap and full of, essentially like corn syrup. And it's this case where it's much like the rest of, King of the Hill. It's like people who are kind of out of time and their instincts are no longer kind of like well suited to their environment.
I mentioned cooking videos, and there's this guy called Cooking with Jack who's like the source for a lot of ridicule online. But he's genuinely the guy who will make food based on like, oh yeah, I found like this 5-pound bag of American like pre-shredded cheese, right? Which is the most disgusting thing I ever seen. And he's going to make food based on that, and everything he makes to someone who's used to higher quality ingredients is just absolutely disgusting. But then considering that, to quote unquote most Americans, that's what they can afford, that's what they get, right?
Well, and you see it, and I see someone in the chat saying this, that because I was fat in high school, and I ended up, actually, this is one of the other reasons I have an attachment to Peterson. It's essentially like I got started on Jordan Peterson and lost like 65 pounds over the course of a summer. And I got like super motivated.
Congrats.
And oh yeah, thank you. And it like changed my life. But a big part of the reason that I got fat was never that I was like, a binge eater or like super into, like food culture even. It's just the default portions in America and the default relationship to food will make you fat no matter what. And so
Bingle had a comment there. Can you bring that up, Walrus?
The meal portion?
Yes.
Well, the meal portion thing, I remember from when I visited the U.S. My dad and I asked our servers at some point, just because we were curious. Like we did this multiple places because the portions are so huge at restaurants. Um, like are we do you expect us to eat all this? Basically was the question. And the servers usually said no. It's like an expectation that you get a doggy bag. But this might be certain types of restaurants, right?
That's true, and that kind of varies. And then again, a lot of it is just that, like, and this is a big class distinction now. Essentially, like in the U.S., like one of the stereotypes you hear from Euros about Americans is that essentially all Americans exist on the extremes. You know, like Americans are either super fit or super fat, and there's very few people.
Everything is bigger in America, is what we say.
Right? Yeah, there's a huge gap, and that's partially true, but a big part of that is class. You know, and so in kind of like my social class, which is kind of like the lower rungs of the laptop class, like the PMC, it is, there are still people who are overweight, but it is a very strong social stigma. And so like in any other time, like your class is like a big signifier is diet. And so it's weird because in kind of like higher end universities, like, you know, universities that I either went to or lived near, like even the parents, like no one is overweight. But then you go to kind of like the Walmart down the street, the IRL Megalomart, and the only person who doesn't, you know, have a BMI of 30 plus is 15. You know, and so it is odd, and the kind of like, and I think that's one of the other reasons that, like, I mean, you look at Hank Hill, and Hank Hill is overweight. You know, Boomhauer's, every one of them's got a gut, and that is very kind of like, that is true to people like them in the real world.
But it is that sort of old school gut, though, isn't it? It's not the hyper obese.
Yeah, it's the beer gut, which is,
yeah,
that is the, like what I was saying, like that's the kind of like working, the working man of
the
kind
working
of like
class gut. Yeah.
He has a little bit too much, you know, you know, beer on the weekends, and he's not super active. And
he's not super active on the weekends. Maybe he works a job that sort of offsets the worst of it, right? Like he has a physical job, but he doesn't work out, so it ends up sort of falls to the gut. Yeah.
One of the other things that you've also seen in this is that part of the other reason I have a lot of, I guess, like affection for this show is that it really is a different time also, in the sense that like obesity is always, like ever since I've been alive, been a massive problem in the US, but it is getting worse and worse over time. And the kind of like a lot of rural America that you see in this, it isn't like rural, like they're all on farms, but it is a, you know, a more like rural show. It is, the people who live there are becoming kind of like more and more like debased and depressed. And so even though there are things in this show, like, you know, like times are like money is, you know, in certain sense scarce, like there's not, you know, there are people who are, you know, you see a lot actually in this, the start of kind of like the drug problems in rural America. You know, like there's a lot of episodes about like crack or things like that. But those trends have only continued. And so even though the world of King of the Hill is not necessarily idyllic, by comparison to what you currently see in places like where I live, you know, which was where the, you know, a lot of the, you know, like the opioid crisis and now like the meth crisis have been really like, you know, kind of like ravaging the communities. It seems idyllic by comparison.
No, I believe it. I absolutely believe it. I mean, just tracing back, another thing that I've noticed, like with American portion sizes, is also that they have free refills on soda, which I assume is another kind of contributor. Like we talked about the soda machines in schools and so on. I mean, yeah, it's almost easier to drink yourself fat than to eat yourself fat, in my experience.
Oh, definitely. And that's another. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but like with the obesity stuff, like I had the impression that obesity was the problem in the United States, and it kind of peaked around like 2010 something, and it's been going down. But you're saying that it's continuing to go up in certain areas.
I would say so. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I have hard data on this. I just kind of have, you know, people I've seen, and I know that a lot of like, especially like rural working Americans are getting just fatter and fatter, and COVID made it exceptionally worse, you know, because obviously a lot of those guys kept, you know, working and kept on their feet. But really what you see a lot is that people are still working hard jobs and they're overweight, and it's just destroying their bodies, because they're just putting a ton of strain on it. So people like my grandfather's a great example, and he stayed, and I kind of feel sympathy for him because he stayed thin while he was smoking. And then when he quit smoking, he started eating to kind of cope with it, which I think is a pretty common thing. And now he's obese. And, even though he's retired, obviously, he's relatively young. He's in his late 60s, but his body's just broken down through a combination.
Yeah, how much is there left, really, right?
I mean, nothing. Like all of his joints are gone. His heart is in terrible shape. And admittedly, a part of that...
You just sort of become like you work all life, you eat like shit because that's all you have access to, and then you sort of just become a liability on the healthcare system, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the other things is that a lot of this show is, and I don't mean to just continually like narcissistically talk about my personal experience in America, but
that's why we have you here.
Yeah, that's why you're here.
One of the things that I do like about this show is that it kind of speaks back to a culture when taking from the government was viewed with a lot of suspicion, and it was a very like low social status activity, and you still see that in a lot of rural America, but less and less over time. And it's kind of shifted, and you've seen this shift, and part of it's just game theory, right? Like if the other person is just like smash and grab, like I'm going to get mine, if you don't also assume the same attitude, you're going to lose out. But I think you've seen a shift from kind of viewing government handouts as a kind of like low class or like undesirable to take, and you saw a bunch of this rhetoric during the Obama years, like, oh, I don't want to be on welfare. Like being on welfare is like this super shameful, like embarrassing thing. And then whereas, now it's much more like, well, I'm going to get mine. And, and some of that
is very interesting because that is something that's in my experience still alive here in Norway, right, Ludwig? I mean,
I'm going to get mine stuff for that. It's shame associated with government handouts.
Yeah.
My
dad even used it when I turned like 16 or something, or 17 or something. He basically told me like, you're going to have to get a job, or because you have to pay me rent if you're going to keep living here, if you're not going to study right now, right?
Yeah, I think it's
so you got to get a job, or you're going to go get welfare. And I'm not going to have a son that gets welfare, so go get a job.
Yeah, no, there is still
basically the message that I got, right?
A stigma around that, and I think in a healthy society there should be a stigma around that. Like repeating what we've said previously in the stream, like in a healthy society, people like Hank Hill should thrive. You shouldn't be punished for being Hank Hill, right? This is like should be like the dominant strategy for how people survive and thrive in society. But yeah, now it's basically, things are just getting worse. And I mean, with the electricity prices and the interest rate increases and inflation and so on, I think people are being more kind of, okay, I'm just going to take whatever I can get, right? I've taken that attitude as well. It's like, okay, if you can get some money from the government, you just take it, because they're the ones who are creating all these problems anyway. So just take money from them. I don't know if you have the same attitude, Walrus.
I do pretty much, yeah. So I think, I mean, this is very interesting, but I think we have to push through. I have to be that guy, and because we have a lot of characters to talk about.
Okay, we'll try to be a little bit quicker. Peggy Hill.
Also, in the chat, be nice to Ashirwad. He doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. All right, I'll go. Peggy is next.
Yes, I mean, I wrote down the kind of like narcissistic white mother that we all know and love, right? But I mean, I feel like I know this character personally, or at least not as dysfunctional as she is, but you kind of like in the the sort of the archetype of the white woman, all of these characteristics that make her so dysfunctional, they exist. But they're all sort of accentuated in her, whether it would be like the sort of lack of self-insight or the idea that she can be like, she's like much better at things than she thinks she is, so that she can sort of, just start a business doing, creating cookies or drawing postcards or something like that. I don't know. She's a great character for creating plots. I think she's the person in King of the Hill who creates the most problems, honestly. And it's much to Hank's credit and his kind of natural, timeless conservatism that he tries to maintain the relationship and tries to meet her halfway, even though meeting her halfway is like just total insanity in certain episodes in this show. How do you guys feel about this character?
I make the joke. Are we going to get demonetized? All right,
What's
the joke? Is so she's a woman. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, but I mean, I think I don't want to like sit and have this be like this kind of MGTOW bash on women show. So we'll have to do a women appreciation stream.
Sure, yeah.
To make up for this, but
we love women here at the Longhouse.
You do, but there are certain
strong women who can work in the fields.
Certain traits that the women have, right? That you can observe, and I think women of different races and different backgrounds have like different types of dysfunction.
Women
like
really do be like that. Yes.
But like with white women, I feel like Peggy Hill is just all of the like typical white woman dysfunctions she has, like every single one of them, and they are like hypercharged, like this kind of like slightly bipolar attitude that she has. Some level of reality denial in terms of her ability, like this kind of like quasi-feminist things where she feels like she's always being overlooked in favor of men, even though it's not the case. Working part-time, like we can just keep going. What do you think, Jay?
So I like the character of Peggy Hill because and this is a broader, I guess, thing I like about this show is that she's obviously a ridiculous character, right? Like that she has these kind of like character faults and character foibles, but they're never
fair, as most characters beside Hank Hill are in the show.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I mean, just to clarify.
I don't know. There's kind of it never comes across to me, at least, as like mean spirited. It's kind of, it is a type of person that exists. And again, like I said, I'm going to say again, like I know dozens of people like her. And again, like it's just the show couldn't be made because, and I think about this in relation to a show like, and obviously this is, get your fedoras out. Like
he would go like full on, Vax. He would have like 7 face shields and try to force Hank to wear it. I feel it.
Oh, really? I feel like she'd be like a Pizzagate type, but
oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Well,
maybe
I know like Southern women, and it
Yeah.
is very much like keep your hands off my kids. You like satanic lizard person.
Okay, yeah, I can see that angle too. Okay, never mind. Maybe you're right.
And maybe it's just me projecting again people I know, but I think that it both come from kind of like the core, like negative.
It's the same Puritan element.
Oh,
right?
yeah, definitely.
This could swing both ways, right? But it would either be keep your lizard hands off my son, or you should wear 7 face masks.
Yeah,
there would be nothing in between with this character.
Yeah. Sorry, continue. If you had
no, not at all. I mean, that's pretty much my piece on it. Is that it is a kind of an honest look at kind of like negative, female traits that you can't do in comedy anymore. Like if this were, the modern show, she'd be the like, the unfulfilled, perfect woman who had to marry Hank, had to like marry down for Hank Hill. Whereas this one, there's a certain part where it's like, and then one of the other things is Hank and Peggy are kind of like equally yoked, and to a certain extent, they were kind of like high school sweethearts who made good, and that idea that like they are kind of like a real couple in the sense that they are, they're from the same background, they're from the same like social group. And that kind of like positive normalcy is not something you really see anymore, specifically in culture.
And the way she sort of takes her role as, wife, mother, homemaker, etc. seriously.
Right, exactly. And
at some point, she actually sort of like lectures Hank on it as well. I don't remember the context, but I do remember she's like, I do, I do the cooking and I do the cleaning and I don't complain, but that has certain expectations of you or something.
Right. And like, okay, fair enough. Maybe it comes across as a little bit, unreasonable. But again, like, one, she's a woman, and two, that kind of like unspoken social contract, the idea that like
Yes,
there are different expectations for men and women, and both sides have a kind of an end of the bargain to hold up, I think is a message that is in this show and is very rare in like American culture, period, and specifically American culture made, I guess, like this late.
Yeah, every other show that you would consider quote unquote contemporary with King of the Hill would by this time have been sort of converted into progressive mouthpiece, right? Just look at The Simpsons.
Exactly, and like these two characters are both more conservative than I think the regular person would have been at, say, in the 1997 or in the early 2000s. Like they still have a lot of that Puritanism. I mean, their backstory is basically that it was sort of Peggy who took all of the initiative, right? She sort of proposed to Hank. I think he wants a wife, but he's a little bit, has a hard time with that, like dealing with the female elements, as you've seen, like these elements where these episodes where they start talking about, sex ed and like women having periods and that kind of stuff. Like he wants none of that stuff. He doesn't want to deal with anything that has to do with like female sexual health or like female sexuality, anything that has to do with that. He just wants kind of that's just like a woman's thing. He's just going to be over there doing his kind of manly good old boy shtick, and the woman's going to have to deal with all the woman stuff. So, and that's kind of what, a part of where some of these problems come from is that he doesn't want to be involved in it, and Peggy kind of gets all the time to like to say influence Bobby, for instance, into a lot of stupid ideas and so on. I don't know if you have a similar impression of the dynamic between these two.
No, I definitely do, and this is again a very, I guess, like a very real thing that, and who knows how much of this is like, the ravages of modernity and how much of this is just what men and women are like. But I think that the same men like Hank Hill birthed the boomer culture of like, oh, I hate my wife. Like my wife is always nagging. But I think that was really born out of kind of like a type of male passivity, that to a certain extent isn't like, it's just a human trait. I'm not going to say it's like specific to a generation, but that kind of like, I'll just leave me alone passivity.
Yeah.
It did birth a lot of kids like Bobby Hill, who just were hyper feminized despite the fact that they had an ostensibly masculine father, just because their father
they had absent fathers, right?
Yeah, absent in effect, if not, physically.
I mean, their father was probably out doing stuff, and when he came home, he was too tired to care, and they were literally left to their mothers and the school system, who had by that point become feminized enough to pretty much be the same.
And when the fathers figured it out, it was too late, right? I mean, another funny thing about Peggy, just jumping from one thing to another, is like the complex she has about her feet size, where she has what is it, like a size 47 or something in American shoes. It's just like this recurring gag where she's insecure about the size of her feet, which are genuinely large. This is also a thing like you couldn't do now, I think, with like a female character in like in anything really. It all has to be like perfect female characters who just have like the kind of complexes and insecurities because of society, right? It's nothing. It doesn't
they have
reflect
to
reality
figure out
in
how
any way,
to
right?
girl boss themselves out of it.
Exactly. Yeah, perfectly put. All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot. We're getting to Luann and a lot of the Trailer Park Boys later.
Sure, we'll just move on.
Yeah. Do you want to comment a little bit on Cotton Hill and
oh yeah, his father,
his mother, yeah, the grandfather.
I mean, to me, I feel like they're more pure comedy characters. Like there's obviously there like, just like in any, there are kind of like elderly, kind of like horny old men in every culture. But to me, like and obviously maybe the kind of like old man obsessed with the glory days, but to me that feels more like a stock character in comedy. It's less like a specifically interesting person to talk about.
I'd agree. The sort of the Korean War vet, or I think is it Vietnam War vet?
Yeah, it would have been Vietnam
Horny,
from my perspective, but there are a lot of guys like
horny
that.
grandpa and the hippie grandma is, it feels very stock. I'll agree with you on that.
And that is actually quite accurate because it like from the vision of Mike Judge, you know, Hank Hill's grandfather or Hank Hill's father was actually supposed to be Tom Anderson from Beavis and Butthead. That's like this the character that he's based off, who has the exact same voice and plays a similar role in that show. But it's really Greg Daniels, who's like this other co-creator who wanted to have like two of these characters that would be more of these comedic foils that Hank could bounce off, and one of them would be Cotton Hill and the other one was Luann Platter. So both of these exist more as comedic foils, but I think that there's a lot more to say about Luann Platter than about Cotton Hill. You get a lot of comedic leverage out of him, but like you said, he is more of just like this pure caricature, the very sort of nasty caricature person who doesn't necessarily accurately reflect anything.
Well, I will say something that's kind of funny is that I've talked before about the massive car collection I worked for, and the guy who's now passed away is actually he was quite a similar person to Cotton Hill, to the point that the scene where it is a flashback to him buying or trying to buy Hank a prostitute is something that my boss would offer and attempt to buy people prostitutes. And so that's something that rewatching episodes for this, I was like, wait a minute, I've had that happen to me
I know that guy. Yeah.
That is an outlier. Like I've never met another person in my life who is like that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do think there is in the old guard, people who were like that, but like with the Me Too culture and all this bullshit that the millennials and Zoomers have been put through, there's increasingly few of those people that are even allowed to exist in society anymore. I mean, of course, you have like Hank Hill's boss, Buck Strickland. We could get back to him later because he's not actually in the Hill family, but he is also that kind of type who would buy people prostitutes and has like this very extravagant, slightly degenerate personality. Okay, well, I think we'll skip to the next bulletin board if there's nothing more to be said.
Right. Yeah. Let's do that. Okay, there we go. So the Gribbles.
Right. I mean, Dale Gribble is described as being Hank's best friend in the show, which is quite weird considering that he is a quite sort of unpleasant, mischievous character. But looking at like the other friends that he had, like Bill Dauterive and Boomhauer, they're quite strange in their own ways, right? So I think his design is based off of Hunter S. Thompson. And he is voiced to sound like William S. Burroughs. So there's quite a few influences there. It was, of course, Greg Daniels' idea to have this guy be kind of a caricature of like this more of the right-wing conspiracy, not where he's being kind of sort of cuckolded by this Native American guy who's John Redcorn, who's pictured here. That was, of course, like Greg Daniels' idea. But still, like in spite of like how sort of pathetic this character is, I still have sort of a fondness for him. He creates a lot of comedic leverage, and there are, even though he's slightly exaggerated, there are a lot of Americans who are like that. But as you mentioned, Jay, Bjorn, this guy's in 2022, this guy's is an insurrectionist, right? He's a domestic terrorist like the American Taliban. But in 1997, this was more of like a funny character, or even say like post 9/11, you'd have these a lot of these 9/11 truthers, and I think it was a quite large portion of the American public who believed in some 9/11 conspiracy, but it was not taken seriously in the way that it is now. So,
well, and it speaks to, in many ways, the kind of like a lot of the progenitors of kind of like the online American right are in some way kind of related to like figures like Dale Gribble. So in the 80s and 90s, there was kind of this rise of what was called like the quote unquote militia movement, and this was, kind of like a very like disparate group of like, kind of like constitutionalists, like more like Wignat types. But this are the kind of events that led to things like Ruby Ridge and Waco, obviously Waco, which happened near Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
And so there was kind of this whole conservative subculture of characters like Dale Gribble, and that was to a certain degree related to figures like Pat Buchanan and, Rush Limbaugh, who is kind of like the premier like American conservative talk radio host. And so like as someone who grew up in a conservative red America, the figures like Dale Gribble, and specifically like also like the gun club where they go to take Bobby shooting, that Dale Gribble's a member of, those are very real places, and less so now as kind of, like time has continued to
You
march
mean
on.
like the homemade thing he's got going on?
No, specifically, I can't remember, but there's the episode, and it's been a while since I've seen it, where it's discovered that Bobby is a crack shot, and they go to like the Rod and Gun Club.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Never mind. Yeah. Yeah.
Those places are very real, and they all look almost identical to that. They're all made out of like horrible plywood and have like pinup calendars from '87 on the wall.
Right.
But my point is like this is an archetype, and it's obviously played up for laughs. But I mean, there are half a dozen people like this that I am friends with, that I know, and a lot of it is in like a certain way is obviously related to people we would view more positively.
Real quick here, Glow in the Dark for $5 says, one of the best episodes of King of the Hill is when Bobby ate a 72-ounce steak while looking a vegan in the eye out of spite.
Yeah, that was a great episode. Like I said, Bobby has a lot of unconventional talents that they do get to display, even though it doesn't lead to any bonding between him and Hank. But so with like this Dale Gribble character, what is interesting is like the amount of conspiracies that people like him can seemingly stack on top of each other. I was listening to JB and your interview with the last one you had with Prudentialist, and you talked about like how you love the American boomer con basically, and they had they live in their own sort of ecosystem where they just believe in every conspiracy they can find, and they find some way where that they can sort of make them work.
They all connect together into one mega conspiracy. Yeah.
Connect where it's like like you said, Barack Obama and Saddam Hussein are related somehow, and they're from Mars, and
that's
moon
what
landing was faked and so on.
Dale Gribble is a character that I like, not because I want to be Dale Gribble or I like think he's a particularly admirable person, but just because like figures like him are kind of like harmless and amusing, and a lot of this comes from, especially with like the boomer conspiracy stuff, like people whose heart is kind of genuinely in the right place. They feel their like way of life slipping. They see that the country that they grew up in is changing, and they've never really again adapted. So they still like have this kind of like credulous nature that leads them to kind of like insane conspiracy theories. And I don't know, as much as I like recognize that they're incorrect, I can never really bring myself to hate those people.
Yes, because the core is something sincere, right? They feel that something has gone wrong somewhere along the way, right? And then they sort of try desperately to figure out what it is. But I think they get limited by their situation and their generation and their worldview, right?
But of course, with Dale Gribble in this show, he's not presented in a way where he's like just trying to hold on to the old ways. He's a bit more of like an open character. If you look at this sort of 5-factor model, where he's very interested in learning about specific topics, and like that's how he spends most of his time, right? Just reading weird books, magazines, listening to police radio in his basement, and just to make a living, he has like this bug removal business. That's like the Dale's Dead Bug thing, which is the thing that I wanted to ask you about, J. Bjorn, is this seems to be like a very kind of prevalent model of business or something that recurs in the United States, where people can put up these single proprietorships for bug removal businesses. Of course, you have bug removal in Norway, but it's usually by like larger companies, and it's a lot more formalized. But yeah, tell us a little bit about that, if that's something you know about.
So we definitely have bigger like bigger companies that do that as well. Like there are any number of firms that do it. But a big part of it is that so much of America is so, I guess, like wet and humid, that there are places where, like rot and weatherproofing is essentially like it is a almost like yearly part of your life. Like specifically, like there are areas which if you don't have someone coming to exterminate bugs, essentially you could lose your house to termites in a matter of years. So that's another part of it, that the demand is just huge. But also one of the like truly positive things about America, it's kind of like undersold, is that there are a lot of, and these are going away, by the way, especially like post Obama and post COVID, that there are a lot of, I guess, kind of careers that are open to kind of like sole proprietors. So for instance, right, like a lot of kind of like home maintenance and kind of like contracting, it's very still relatively easy to, as a single guy, kind of start your own business. And so that also applies to things like, waste disposal or like exterminators, people like that. So that is very real. And there are a lot of, I guess, people who essentially like ride that kind of like into the kulak class. So a girl I went to high school with, her family was very wealthy, and they were wealthy because her father essentially started a plumbing business himself and turned that into kind of like a local plumbing empire, and that is still albeit less and less, that is still a path towards material prosperity. And even if it doesn't make you rich, like there are a lot of like people who have businesses like that who essentially like support themselves kind of outside the system.
Yeah, no, I actually think that's a great thing about the United States. It's very difficult to do that in Norway. I think because of a lot of the red tape and the regulations. You get.
I had
punished.
some issue with that a couple of years ago when I had to remove some. I tried to remove some wasps from my house, which aren't a protective species, but I wasn't sure if it was wasps or bees. I couldn't get close enough to see, so I had to start this entire insurance apparatus just to get someone from some random exterminator company to come to my property and basically be like, "Yep, that's wasps. You can remove them safely." So there was a lot of red tape just to remove some bugs.
Whereas in the US, if you can't yourself buy the cancer-causing Monsanto product to essentially to demolish it from 50 feet away, you can definitely have some good old boy in a trucker hat there in 45 minutes to douse your lawn and
exactly right.
And to be fair, this is actually like a more serious note, but a lot of people have given themselves, and maybe some of that, like the protections you're talking about are good, because a lot of people have given themselves very serious like lifelong genetic damage from pesticides. And in rural communities, it's very common on kind of like local television to see ads, essentially for like class action lawsuits saying like, "Oh, were you exposed to XYZ chemicals?" Because so many of these chemicals were essentially handed out to anyone who wanted them. And they ended
there
up.
is a middle ground, right, between too much red tape and no red tape at all. I think a lot of the dissident right would agree. We're not libertarians.
No, definitely.
Glow in the Dark for another $5 says, Mr. Gribble was right about trans women. Only natural women would get their money's worth at gynecologists, and even his conspiracy theories came true. Well, that's one of those funny things, in that a lot of the things that comes out of Gribble's mouth end up being quite prophetic in a weird sense.
Yes, I think that's true. Like for many conspiracy theorists, although, like we mentioned previously, this is kind of he tends to believe like almost every conspiracy that he can find. Where for this character, it almost seems to be a bit more of like a brand of hobby. Just to find as many conspiracies as he can, and read up on them, and sit and read about UFOs and reptiles and so on. But continuing a little bit more about the Gribble situation and the Gribble's family, it's sort of a running joke in this show that he is married to like a quite attractive news anchor. That's Nancy Gribble, that's pictured there, and she has for 12 years had like a continuing affair with this kind of Chad Native American John Redcorn, and Nancy has a son, like with John Redcorn there. That's I think Joseph is his name, right? And they keep just sort of playing this comedy, this sort of comedic bit over and over again, where like Dale is super suspicious about everything that everybody else does, but he can't just kind of see the conspiracy that's going on underneath this.
And also everyone in the
nose.
neighborhood is aware that that she's cheating on him. Right?
Yes,
everyone but Dale
everybody
knows.
And
There's this
and
very
Dale
early
and Peggy,
episode
actually.
where there's this very early episode where I think Bobby is talking to Joseph. They're hanging out and they're saying something. He's like, "Yeah, I think that's in Dale Gribble's truck," says Bobby, and then Joseph goes like, "Oh, you mean my dad?" Oh yeah, says Bobby. Your dad.
Well, and that's also something that I think is kind of funny, because in one of the earlier episodes, and this is another like anti-bureaucratic sentiment, the episode where a kind of like wet behind the ears social worker thinks that Hank Hill beats Bobby, and the idea that in kind of like these small like rural southern towns that these kind of rumors spread like wildfire, but there's nothing will ever be directly addressed. So everyone knows about Dale Gribble and his wife. Everyone knows, the instant the rumor goes out that Hank Hill beats his kids, but no one ever talks to Hank Hill about it. It's all just kind of these like old women, like making faces at him. And so that is very true to life.
Glow in the dark for another $5. Dale, at the end of the day, would happily sacrifice himself for others, like when he sacrificed himself to fire ants to save Bobby. Yeah, but to be fair, he put the fire ants on Hank's lawn. So.
Yes, I mean, because Dale is different from the other characters in the fact that he, in spite of being quite pathetic and unathletic, he has big thoughts, like he wants to be a super spy, and he thinks about like, government agencies and geopolitics, and, he wants to kind of be an assassin and a superhero and so on, and like, sacrificing himself in some kind of heroic endeavor. It's for him a kind of a great end in a sense, even though he doesn't really have what it takes to be an actual hero. But like with the Dale and the Nancy Gribble situation, I've looked a little bit at these sort of fan communities on surrounding King of the Hill, and I didn't realize that like Nancy is actually considered one of the most kind of hated characters because of the continued affair with John Redcorn. But I think like maybe that's kind of an unpopular take, but in this situation, it's almost like property law. If like somebody walks into your house and like they'll start sleeping in your bed and you don't say anything, and they've been sleeping in your bed for like 12 years.
And
How long
can you have sex with your wife before you have basically just lost?
Well, like, okay, now they live in your house, right? If you after 12 years and they've slept in your bed, then you go to the courts to complain about it. They basically they would just ignore it because you've sort of like permitted that to happen to the point where it's become like the new stable arrangement. Yes.
Oh, I was just saying. I mean, essentially, he has squatters' rights to his wife.
Yeah, exactly. That's sort of almost how I think about it. If it's been going on for 12 years, then he has the squatters' rights, as you said. But it's interesting because like John Redcorn has a lot of arcs in this show as well that relates to more of like Native American culture in the United States. That's kind of an interesting chapter onto itself. And it's something that I was almost a little bit hesitant to discuss my thoughts on because, like you said, the dissident right is a sort of surprisingly diverse community, right? I think we probably have like a higher amount of like non-whites and trans people than you'd see in a regular like boardroom or sort of a white-collar workplace that is progressive.
FIFA meeting.
But I don't know how many like Native American dissident writers that exists, to be honest. So.
That's also so the one person I know, and he's not directly dissident right. He's kind of a more like conspiracy libertarian. But I know Ryan Dawson is Native American, but that's such a specific like insular community. I don't know anything about it. So even though I'm American, I can't really offer anything on that.
Well, you see, I've been to Oklahoma, right? And they have a lot of like Native American communities there, where like one thing that is pretty big in the United States is being able to prove that you have some ancestor that was Native American because it entitles you to a lot of government gifts. And that's been like the joke with Donald Trump and Elizabeth Warren, where she's like Pocahontas because she jotted down that she was Native American to get into college, right? So like in Oklahoma, they have like it's just this insane thing where you'll meet someone who's just like white as mayonnaise, and they'll describe themselves as like, I'm Cherokee or I'm Hopi Indian or something, and they have like 1/64th Native American ancestry. It's like this absolutely absurd type of thing. And in the first place, I do not know why they would even want to identify themselves with this community, either for just some kind of sentimental aesthetic reason. Because like John Redcorn, I feel like he represents a lot of these Native Americans in the fact that he's a completely kind of pitiful, pathetic character. You know, Dale is able to help him out, like later in the show, get reparations for some stuff, and where he's able to kind of like buy his own casino, and that goes to shit because, you know, that's a thing in the United States as well, where you know, if you're Native American, you're actually allowed to run casinos, which other groups are not able to. There's other things that you can do, like say grow peyote as well. I think you can grow these cacti in your garden that are psychedelic. There's certain drugs that you can grow because it's considered a part of the Native American culture and so on. So it's pretty hot to just have to say that, you know, to look white, to be sort of white passing and have to get the Gibbs at the same time. But I mean, the arc for this character is really that he tries to get in touch with his son. It doesn't work because he can't really commit. I mean, he runs this sort of like massage business out of a trailer home where he spins plates and he sleeps with a lot of women. You know, aside from Nancy Gribble, I mean, like given his physiognomy, that's pretty easy for him. But he is an absolutely kind of like sad character who gets a lot of stuff, you know, gets all these Gibbs thrown at him, but nothing seems to ever make things better. And that's kind of how, you know, this community is, even though like they're not a part of the conversation in any point. We talk about like the Black community and the Mexicans and stuff, but yeah, these people exist and they get all these, you know, Gibbs. But I would like we said with the Black community, I would not want to be them in like any way possible. So
yeah. Glow in the Dark for $10 says if this show was based, it would have had a character say to Redcorn that his people were not the angels people portray them as, and they did worse things than the U.S. government ever did. Tribes are tax-free. There's a lot of chatter about the show not being based, and you know, I would ultimately agree with King of the Hill as a general show isn't based because it's made by a Gen Xer who sort of like time capsuled a different, better time. But at the same time, this is a people that still exist. Like the people the show portrays still exist, and they're someone that's gonna have to be, you know, accounted for when we win. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I mean, regarding Glow in the Dark's comment, there is an episode where John Redcorn goes more on this kind of guilt trip thing, where he starts talking, you know, goes to the school where Bobby and Joseph attend and starts talking about, you know, everything that was done to their people and like what the white man did to me and so on. And he tries to kind of drive a wedge between you know, children and parents with this kind of like white guilt complex stuff. So it ends up with like Bobby Hill wanting to do like a presentation and a kind of celebration of John Redcorn's culture, which, I mean, because he is a kid and he doesn't understand political correctness, he does research on John Redcorn's tribe, which is basically that they were cannibals. And he just has like this big presentation about how they were, you know, cannibalistic, and he's sort of prepared like an honor meal that's like this kind of synthetic human head that he starts serving to people. And I mean, like Bobby has a lot of those kind of like accidentally based moments where he will either you know, try to make fun of Native American tribes, or where he accidentally like steals Stormfront jokes and performs them at like this ethnic stand-up club and so on. So I mean, yeah, there are some kind of like slightly based episodes. I mean, we have to live in reality here. Like, I mean, you're not going to get a show that's like this, that's considered one of like the best and biggest, longest running sitcoms, and people are going to
it's not like Julius Evola is going to feature on Family Guy, and he's going to
the characters are not going to like goose step around reading Evola and that kind of stuff. sorry, it's not going to happen. Like this is this is as good as you're going to get given the situation that we are in.
Right, like within the kind of like bounded rationality of like mainstream television, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
on from the Gribbles?
Yeah, I think we can move on from the Gribbles. I mean, I put his dad in the top corner there just to finish it up. Where this is like a slight arc about his dad's closeted homosexuality, and the character in the top left there that is like the recurrent meme in the show Rusty Shackleford. That is because Dale Gribble is so paranoid, right? So every time he has to give his address or his number, he always gives the name Rusty Shackleford, but eventually in the later seasons, there's like an actual person whose name is Rusty Shackleford who's trying to get a business loan, and his credit has been completely trashed because like Dale doesn't pay for anything under that name. So it's a funny little detail. But we can move on to the next one. So, I mean, this is like the neighborhood gang slide where I just wanted to discuss the two other characters. So you have the Boomhauer and Bill Daltreve. Boomhauer is he doesn't get that much screen time in like the first seasons. He's just played for laughs, and the fact that he speaks very quickly in this kind of very, I don't know exactly, where do you think he comes from, Jay?
So have you guys ever, and maybe I should have sent you this before, but have you ever seen the actual basis for Boomhauer?
Oh.
Yeah, I think
this is great. I will drop this link in the private chat. But essentially what it is that it is a regional dialect of kind of like Oklahoma, North Texas. But what happened is that Mike Judge, when he was working on Beavis and Butthead, got a voicemail from this guy who was incredibly irate about something. And it's actually quite difficult to like understand like what he's really mad about. But this was the basis for the Boomhauer character. Sorry, as this just loads in. But and so he essentially based the character off of an irate like voicemail. Like he somehow got Mike Judge's personal phone number. So this is a video recording of his answering machine.
Interesting.
And maybe we can bring that up. But it's
I'll bring it up. Let's see here.
It's legitimately hilarious. Like I've watched it probably half a dozen times, and it kills me every time, because once you hear it, you realize like, oh, that is just a one-to-one recreation of the character of Boomhauer. So I've heard other videos that it is kind of like a unique regional dialect. I've never met someone who talks like this. I thought it was a complete fabrication. So I think it must just be like an extremely specific Texas thing.
Let's see here. Okay, I'll play the clip.
I've been calling y'all for better than a month, growling about y'all every time Looney Tunes come on. Y'all put Porky's butthole on. I figured last night, and the second cartoon come on, it was Porky's friggin' old butthole. I said, surely y'all ain't gonna put the last two on Porky's friggin' butthole. Now y'all gonna die if y'all don't put Porky's friggin' butthole on the last daggone cartoon like y'all did this morning. I've seen a daggone crap 5.5 million times. I don't see why in the heck y'all think these daggone youngsters are gonna sit there and watch Porky's daggone butthole time after time after time after time, and don't ever get tired of it. Like, and yes to y'all, I got upset.
All right, I think we get the idea, but that was great. Yeah.
So
that is a one-to-one translation, pretty much. Yeah,
exactly, and it's completely incomprehensible. I heard someone in the chat saying that's Bayou. I don't think it is. I've been around people who have a like a Cajun accent, and that is, while equally incomprehensible, I think it's a different accent. But I think that's the kind of
he drawls as much as the Bayou does. If that's the correct lingo.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
And Poggy's butthole, I assume that's Beavis and Butthead or something that he's misunderstood.
Yeah, that's my best guess. I mean, if you can figure out what he's talking about, I can't. That's my best guess again.
Yeah, his mouth just runs. I was laughing, but I was muting myself. So, but are you summing up these two characters?
Another thing I've noticed with these characters, and you even bring it up here, because there's this edits that people do of these characters, like putting them into different shows and context. And immediately I noticed that when you posted, Jay, that you were going to be on the show, like immediately the first response was someone posting Fallout New Vegas edits of this show. There is something about these characters that sort of lends itself to this kind of memeability. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, no, it's a show that it is both memeable in the sense that it's very easy to take a clip out of it and make it funny, but it's not really meme humor, and I don't know how it manages to bridge that divide.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But
All right, do we want to cover the? Sorry,
I just wanted to explain these two characters. I mean, you have Boomhauer with the incomprehensible accent, but he is revealed later he is actually a police officer, right? That's like in one of the last episodes where that actually comes up. He likes fast cars, and he's really sort of a proto like PUA. That's his more of what his character is, and you see that he has a tan because he has a tanning bed at home. He's kind of standard water, rotating bed, fluorescent dimmed lighting and so on. There's this episode where he actually tries to teach like Bobby tricks for picking up women, and like his only trick is like persistence, basically.
It's like a numbers 25 women or something, and he gets one number.
Yeah, numbers game, right? On the right there, you have Bill Daltrey. That's really like this kind of completely broken down character that is he works as a military barber, right? And he's barely able to sort of keep his job cutting hair in the military, and being like this completely psychologically unstable, neurotic, pathetic character, right? Who's, like you said, that's what happened to him. Like he, it's revealed later in the seasons that he used to be like this alpha Chad of the group. Like he was like the most good-looking athletic person, but after his wife divorced him, he's just gone on this downward spiral into this completely pathetic, unhygienic, lonely state where he just serves as more of this comedic foil, and the other characters have to take care of him like he's a child. And but this is one of my the sort of larger meta themes about this show, in my view. Like, I'm not looking at this as sort of like this is like the progressive future that's coming in, where these characters have to adapt. I think this is very much a show about like American decline, because it's being shown in real time, and one of the larger signs of the decline is infertility, right? Which is a topic it's not really explicitly discussed, or it is like with Hank Hill, but you have this gang here that are basically 4 white men, and they have like one white child between them, right? That's sort of Hank's son, that he was barely able to quote unquote conceive, because there's like this running joke where Hank Hill has like a narrow urethra. He has this this thing where he just it's very very little actually comes out of his let's say his equipment. So they try to actually have a second child in the show, but they're not able to. But like in spite, he is the one who's actually putting in the most effort into trying to, let's just say, repopulate the planet. Whereas these other characters, like Dale, is just kind of oblivious. I don't think he has, it's sort of revealed that he doesn't actually have sex with his wife at all. He just says that he's on sort of NoFap, and that gives him like cosmic powers. I mean, it's pretty funny, right? NoFap didn't exist, but it's like he just says that I'm saving up my sexual energy,
saving up his real,
to be able to kind of like connect with the astral realm and so on. Boomhauer has a lot of luck with women, but he's not interested in commitment and children or anything like that. And Bill Daltrey is just kind of like this wreck as a result of no fault divorce. So it's
in the dark, referring here probably to Boomhauer. We were speaking about it, and it's more of a NASCAR dialect, but it was slower. I'm not sure.
Never heard about NASCAR dialect. Do you know about that, Jay Bjorn?
I know generally what he's talking about, but it is at least in my mind, because like I do live in kind of like NASCAR country, so to speak, and it is I think a very specific regional dialect, and obviously like the fast talking, like that is kind of like the NASCAR like announcer, but the difference between that and the Porky's butthole voice or the Boomhauer voice, I think is like an order of magnitude.
Right.
Yes. But yeah, to continue on the infertility point here, I mean, of course, I know that these are characters in a cartoon show, but I feel like it does reflect on reality quite a bit. You're going to see a lot of, gangs and posses that will be in similar situations where you just wonder, like, what the fuck happened to the kids, like white people used to have a fertility rate of like 7 kids per couple, and like you have 4 able men here and they can only produce like 1 kid between them. Like there is just so many factors here that you can go into each of the individual reasons for why this is happening, but there is like this almost like this Spenglerian cycle thing that's going on where there's like this complete kind of infertility and sterility that just comes over the culture at some point. So I don't know if any of you have had made some thoughts on that topic in regards to King of the Hill.
Nothing further than these characters sort of all being sad in their own way.
Yeah, I'm probably in a similar. I see what you're getting at, but I don't know if I have anything, I guess, like specific to add.
So yeah, just
these are side characters, so I mean, there's
but they do get their own episodes where they're fleshed out. Like Bill Dauterive character here, it's apparently revealed that he is a part of some like old Southern aristocratic, stock.
Yeah,
basically that it's kind of suffering from the same problem that he's like the last living, it's a link to this larger like Southern family. But of course, he's being completely incompetent as he is. There's just no, it doesn't go anywhere. So, but again, super funny. I like both of these characters just for the amount of comedy that they provide to the show. Right. Do we want to flip to the next slide?
I think we'll head on over to the Laotian Americans. Are you Chinese or Japanese?
Yeah, so this is, on the right there, you have like the Sinpanusen family that moves into the neighborhood of the Hills and the other characters, and it's sort of played for laughs in many ways, where they're, the Sinpanusen family, they're quite unpleasant, and they try. The Hills and the Gribbles, like they try to welcome them in, but there's a lot of friction between them. Not only because they're Asian, but also because they're, let's say that they're more white collar. What's his name? Con Sinpanusen.
And they're Californian as well.
Yes, certainly. And Con Sinpanusen, I think he has like a job of like a systems analyst is the description, but he's basically some kind of like software tech job. Where he makes a lot of money. I'm not sure what Min does. Of course, they have like a single kid there as well. Of course, the friction between them and the Hills, it creates a lot of storylines, even though they're able to reconcile because of the kids, basically. So there is like this kind of plot where there's a sort of romance developing between Bobby and the daughter here. She's nicknamed Connie, but her name is actually Con Jr. for some reason. Of course, when Joseph gets a little bit older, this turns into like this kind of triangle drama that, it's sort of a relief for Hank Hill, because it's sort of implied that he expects that Bobby is gay, right? When they figure out when he learns that he's trying to sort of swoon Connie, then he's kind of relieved a little bit. But one of the things that I think is interesting about the Laotians here, because I didn't know that much about Laos prior to this show. I'd sort of heard about the country previously in relation to tourism, but it is like this much smaller Asian country with about 7 million immigrants that I think was a part of like Siam previously, and it was taken over by a communist party in the 1950s, and it sort of ran as a communist country until 1975, and it's still sort of a one-party state, a little bit like China, where it's like it's still sort of the people from the Communist Party who run the country, but they've gone a lot more moderate in terms of their policies in allowing more free trade and policies that are more, let's say, friendly to the kind of global American world order.
Yeah.
But like the reason I bring that up is because I feel like there is such an amount of deracination with these characters, and it's something that actually creates storylines in the show as well, where you talk about like the deracination of the Texans who live there, and the people who are just interested in NASCAR and watching television and just going to work and getting hammered on the weekend and stuff. But like the Sinpanusen family really just have no connection to their homeland whatsoever, and they're only interested in consumer lifestyles, watching reality television, buying a bigger house, getting a bigger car. Like there's a plot where he builds a pool in his yard. Like it's really shown that they are incredibly kind of like shallow, mean-spirited characters in a sense. But that's where like the family on the left here, that's the Wasanason family, comes in. And Ted Wasanason, that's the sort of bald character with the glasses here. He is a recurring character, almost like a type of villain, where I realize that he's probably one of the most hated characters by the fan community. But like his storyline is that he is also Laotian, but he's much more interested in like the goings on in Laos than Khan. And there's like this plot where he basically tries to recruit Khan to fight in the resistance army to overthrow the communist government in Laos. Which is where they bring in like this topic of not the topic, but the term like banana, basically like the Asian banana that is yellow on the outside and white on the inside, right. and trying to use that as a kind of slur for the kind of deracinated Asians. So, I mean, in spite of like the Vasanasan characters being kind of playing a villain role and being hated, I think that he's like accidentally kind of based in a sense where he had to leave Laos because he didn't like the situation, but he's just trying to use America as a kind of opportunity to build a new community and to gather resources so he can assemble a kind of Laotian community to send back and overthrow the government, right?
He's also seems to have more money than Khan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Like that's
he is a little bit older, and he actually knows how to handle money, right? Because it's shown that Khan is basically like this compulsive consumer spender. Like he blows all the money on crap as soon as he gets it. Whereas the Wasanasans, he's much better at investing, doing this kind of property investment. I think even his design is based on some Chinese famous property investor, although I don't remember his name in particular. So there's also these subplots that go on with like this kind of country club that they have that's pictured down in the right corner, where Khan keeps trying to get into this country club, but he's just always rejected until he actually tries to recruit Hank as like this honorary white member. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. They have a son as well that plays a bit of a bully in the show. So I don't know, Jay, do you have any, what did you think of these characters?
I think one of the things this is another kind of like thing you couldn't do in a show, is I was actually surprised because I hadn't really watched the early episodes of the show again since I became kind of more politically aware. And I was kind of expecting them to be the kind of like idyllic American immigrant family, and to be painted with this like, extremely like soft touch. And I was surprised at how like, especially Khan and his wife are just genuinely dislikable people. And I think that is, not something you could really get away with in modern America. They're not like my favorite characters. I mean, I find them irritating. I also think that's like admittedly kind of the point, but I did think that was interesting because you really couldn't have immigrants portrayed negatively, I think, in like a post-Trump world. And I'm using that term because the people who write the think pieces would use that term,
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, it's like I don't have much particularly insightful to say, but it is just interesting to see a show where you can still actually like examine the genuine problems of kind of like outsider groups, coming into kind of a specific local culture.
Yes, and I do think it's interesting how they show that they form, these kind of in-group, quote unquote, mafias, right? And I mean, it's very typical for American immigrant groups. We know that, where it's like the founding stock has just kind of remained and become deracinated, live as more as individuals, and they just kind of run from, they sort of do white flight if things get a little bit too heavy. But the immigrant groups always organize themselves into like these kind of fraternities, brotherhoods, through industry and getting into like the same types of jobs and so on. I mean, do you have a lot of that going on in Virginia?
Less so in my area, but actually one of the reasons that my state, which was a kind of a conservative heartland for a long time, like it's where, figures like Jerry Falwell were from, and it was solidly red for a very long time. But because it kind of like butts up against, the what is referred to as Nova or Northern Virginia, which is like the DC sprawl, it is flipped blue. And a big part of that is essentially one, just like regular generic American like laptop go anywhere class. And the other part is that there's been a massive amount of immigration, right? So even Paul Fahrenheit, who lives in that area, he always talks about like this area essentially exists as like a high class Indian colony. That there are essentially like upper caste Indians everywhere, like a lot of like, well educated, Asians of all varieties. And so that is less so in my area because I'm about 200 miles south of there, but it is something that has affected my state to such a degree that my state is, even though we have a Republican controlled governor now, is a reliable blue state, largely because of people like Khan.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
It's a
very
weird thing
interesting.
that usually, the immigrants, they seem to talk conservative but vote liberal all the time. It's very strange. Like
Yeah,
they live and talk conservative, but they vote liberal.
And I think part of that is that they still are plugged into the Gibbs system, less so with kind of like Southeast Asians, and we may see that switch. But
Yeah.
I think that, and this is a rank racial stereotype, but like being so focused on like social acceptability and kind of like doing the kind of like socially acceptable thing, being very like outwardly image focused, being left wing is seen as like high class and civilized. And so obviously there are distinct minorities, like particularly the Korean population in the US is particularly conservative. Again, going back to the Rodney King riots, but also like I live near a very large like evangelical college, and there's a shocking amount of Koreans there. But I think that other groups are much more likely to be swayed by like the like socially acceptable thing to do. And fair enough, that may change, as we see kind of like political alliances shift in the US.
But I mean, you see it sort of even in the Rodney King stuff. I mean, the Korean immigrant is forced to take a position about whether or not he's going to have to shoot at black people just because he lives in America, right?
Right. And it's difficult. So I agree with you. And I think that at least until now, and we're kind of starting to see as the progressive coalition, is fracturing in the US, that these different like client groups are starting to run up against each other. So that
it's kind of what Moldbug is talking about when he's saying that it's about what's cool, that what's cool is sort of shifting.
So we'll see, but at least for now, they are, despite being, allegedly very socially conservative. And actually, now that I think about it, maybe another part of this is that there are different in-group and out-group rules, and so we're kind of like one rule for the in-group, a different rule for the out-group that I think is very
definitely
kind of like minority groups in the West.
No, yeah, I had where I live, there is I say sizable, it's not very sizable, but considering like percentages, it's a sizable Vietnamese population that you wouldn't know it until you walk by the Catholic Church on a Saturday. Then suddenly, that's every Vietnamese person in like a two-hour drives area. And I had a couple of Vietnamese friends growing up, and I got to see it like firsthand how different life is within and without, inside and outside of the home, right?
Right.
To the point where they would have names that were intended for us. Like they would have one outside name and one family name. Like I'd be visiting a Vietnamese friend, and like his mom would call him something else, right? Because that's not the name he used outside to the foreigners, right?
Well, that's actually pretty common. So one of the biggest plagues of modern education currently is rich Chinese students, because in the way that university works in the US is that there are kind of two systems. There are state schools and private schools. So the state schools are funded by state governments, and they are required to let in a certain percentage, varies where you live, of people who live in that state. And if you're outside of the state, you don't receive subsidized tuition. Your tuition is generally about 3 times as expensive.
Right.
And so the schools have this massive incentive to bring those kids in because they bring in a lot of money. And so there's continually problems where essentially like out-of-state students are being let in at a greater rate than they're supposed to be, right? You can obviously see the game theory problem. Now that is even more so the case with international students, and specifically with China, because there are a lot of exceptionally, wealthy Chinese kids who want a, American education, for whatever that's worth. Apparently it still has some cachet in Eastern Asia.
Probably has some carry some weight, back in China.
Right, exactly. And so they come over. And so, for instance, I went to a higher end state school. Like my program was top 20 in the nation, which isn't incredible, but like on the upper end of state schools. And there were the kind of like, like shitty student ghettos, where you paid too much money for a crappy apartment. And then there was like a Chinese area, and they had essentially bought what would have been like family homes, which were very expensive, because they were all brand new, and they were all owned by Chinese students. And they were driving cars to school that were, $300,000, $400,000, brand new supercars, while your students are there and they're like shitty Honda Civics. But the funny thing about them is when the teachers called roll, it would be, a Chinese name. And then the kid would stand up and in not particularly good English say like, yeah, just call me Paul or call me Tom, like very generic names. And so I think that's a pretty common practice.
Yeah, I've heard about similar things, and I can confirm that the stuff about like the Vietnamese and the Koreans, where they have like different names for you inside and outside of the group, and different names for themselves, and even stuff that they talk about, where they do have the awareness that certain topics that you don't bring up to the out group, right, or certain things you don't ask about. I mean, say for instance, like with the Japanese, they have this thing with like blood type, for instance, and age. Where it's common for them, if they meet someone who's Japanese, they'll ask about, like your age, where you came from, and your blood type. And it's considered completely normal, but they'll never ask that to a Westerner, at least not in my experience.
Yeah, they're very conscious of the faux pas. Let's see here, glow in the dark for another $5. Thank you so much. Most immigrants want to be seen as acceptable by those in charge, so they will vote liberal as they control almost everything. Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very simple way of viewing at it, and I do agree that that's part of it. It's just a very interesting phenomenon that it just seems to happen all the time. How sort of coordinated they seem in it.
Yeah, exactly, and I mean, how much do they have to gain from voting Republican, right? I mean, they're able to sort of maintain their own local communities where they have their in-group rules, and they can maintain a certain conservatism there, regardless of how like degenerate the actual policies are, because they just have parallel.
Exactly, they can police their own local community and then vote for more Gibbs. So why not?
Yeah, exactly. So, but of course, there will be some breakage in these communities. Like I saw something that was posted on Clossington's Telegram for a couple of weeks back that it's like this black influencer who was on, his name was Charleston White or something. He was on the Say Cheese YouTube channel, and he was talking about like this, diamonds and jewelry. Where I wasn't aware of this, but there's like this. Famous Vietnamese guy, it's called Johnny Dang, right? And he sells like this jewelry to a lot of these black rappers and so on. And like Charleston was just basically talking about how like Asian people are fucking trash and like they're just exploiting black people, and like they should be able to find other black jewelers and people they can buy gold from, because like Asian people they just come to America to rip black people off, right? It's kind of like this Kanye mindset.
I mean, looking at the statistics, if you're an Asian person selling to black people, I would be careful.
I'm not touching that one, but yes.
But yeah, I mean, the relations between some of these client groups, I mean, it's not hot, right? And I realize that it's never been particularly attractive. Like if you're an Asian person, you set up a store in some black neighborhood. I guess it is a little bit like it is in that Wayne's Brothers movie from the 90s. Don't Be a Menace. I don't know if you've seen it. It's like one of these kind of
I'm unaware.
comedies, but you could just search for it on YouTube, where it'll just have the clips where
the weird thing here is that that's the norm. I mean, historically, right? If some foreign guy, sets up a shop in your village, you run him out, right?
Yeah, well, you typically
That's the norm. I mean, that's why the meme. What is it? How many nations is it? 129.
I think it's 109.
Right?
Yeah,
109. Okay, yeah.
But I mean, of course, if the shop is like really useful to whatever geopolitical strategy the elite have, then it changes things. But from like the local populist perspective, it's always just run them
and
out,
that's what I'm
regardless
saying.
of
If an Asian guy
what they
sets up
want.
a jewelry shop in a black neighborhood, he's going to get run out.
Yeah, but I mean, in that Say Cheese interview, like Charleston, he talked about a lot of the inner workings of like the black community in the United States, and it's something that's quite fascinating to me, because you look at them from the outside and they seem somewhat coherent, but there's a lot of incoherency inside of the community, where they're sort of like a lot of them are apparently suspicious of their own kind, right? It's sort of, if you're black in the United States, if you want to, let's say, like get the cosign for a mortgage or something else, like you should always bring a white person. Like they basically look at buying stuff from white people, or for Asians it's like a higher level of trust or quality, because if you like the stuff you buy from other black people, it's always considered to be like low class, or to be something of low quality. I mean, I wasn't aware that they had this was sort of an internal logic within that community, but the more you learn, right?
Well, and I don't know very much about the black community really at all, but I kind of have seen that on the back end, working and kind of like selling, because I've bought and sold a lot of cars, just as a hobby. And it was always odd, because like it was very clear that when if I sold a car to a black guy, which I did like once or twice, very carefully, it was very clear that like he saw me and he was like, oh, like this is like a high status, like high class thing. And I'm like, it is, and I didn't know that, but realizing that actually makes sense, because that kind of explained like a few social interactions I've had. That actually makes sense.
That's the fun thing about working like any place where you sell something, because you quickly pick up on like racial dynamics and how that stuff works. Like if like an Iranian guy comes into your store, you can, I mean, for me, it was selling like tech stuff for a couple of years while I was studying. And if the Iranians ever came into the store, I knew that they were wealthy, because any Iranian who made it to Norway would have been from the first wave back in the 70s, meaning that they were basically leftists and academics with a lot of money, right? Who had made it well here in Norway. So if an Iranian guy came into my store, I just make sure that they got good service, because they always came back and spent a lot more money. It's those things you learn when you're like working behind the counter somewhere, like when, as you said, like, oh, it's a black guy coming in, he's gonna look at me with like, this is gonna be a good deal.
Well, right, and that was one of the weird things, is like I would be working, and I'm not trying to dox myself, but I'm like a 6 foot tall, like like pretty like white looking white guy, right? Like I've got pretty pale skin. I dress like a relatively conservative white guy, and so when some like bigger black guy would walk up to me like as his choice of salesman, I was always like, excuse me,
why are you here?
Yeah, like do I like no offense, like I'm happy to sell to you, but am I giving off some type of signal here? That's funny, because from sales I very much learned the same thing. And like and that's actually one of the other things, to bring it back to, this was something that Mr. Patriarch was talking about, which is that like which nation or culture has the best salesman. Because, and what I said is that I think that there's a tradition of kind of like the American honest deal that I have not seen in other cultures. Specifically, like I've had the displeasure of buying and selling with some Nigerians, which I did not.
Oh yeah,
very scummy. But to me, that's something else that I see in kind of like King of the Hill, is that idea that like Hank Hill is a salesman, and it's kind of like played as a joke that he loves, being a propane salesman. But I don't know. To me, that idea that like being a salesman is not like a dishonest thing, that it is like an honest profession. I think that is a very like American
the
idea.
European, or I suppose it's the European, and of course the Anglo, therefore American, is a lot more rigid on that. It is, bartering isn't a thing, right? And it's very uncomfortable to travel somewhere where you have to haggle, where that's the norm.
For me as well. I mean, you don't have to go further than say like Southern Europe, like somewhere like Italy and Spain, and like dealing with the salespeople there. I hate it. I hate it. There's it's like the haggling expectation and the dishonesty, the bootlicking and so on. That's I of course I prefer like the sort of Hank Hill style.
Well, and
tell me what the price is, and I'll buy it if I want to.
Well, right, and even within like areas where there is like an expectation of making a deal, it's always like there's like a bell curve of acceptable, like over or undercharging. Like I would never, like it would be offensive to me if I were negotiating a contract and someone offered me like 50% of what I felt like I was worth, or if I asked 150% of what I thought something was worth. Like that idea would be like, that would end the deal. You'd be like, who do you think I am? And that does seem to be a very, let's just say like Northern European attitude.
And it's weird because when you think about Americans here, it's that version of America, right? The image that we get, but it's also Donald Trump who would ask for the 50%, right?
Well, and that is those are two distinctly different cultures. Like that is
probably
funny, but that is kind of like New York culture, which is very distinct from the kind of like Southern Southwest culture as seen of King of the Hill. And that's actually
definitely,
if we can return to the eternal like American question, the AQ, if you will, that while there are certain things that are distinctly like broadly American, there are very distinct subcultures. And that's actually one of them, because when I was buying and selling cars, like working with that car collection, because it was so specialized, we met with clients from all over the US, and there was a distinctive difference in specifically how like, and I hate to say it, but I didn't realize that even what people who would have been called like the quote unquote like white ethnics, 50, 60 years ago. So, Polish, Italians, people like that, who were like the Ellis Island Coalition types. Like that is a very distinctly different culture from old stock Americans. And like the idea of kind of like the shady used car salesman is like, slicked back hair, like hairy chest, kind of creepy looking. Like that is essentially a stereotype about like Polish and Italian immigrants, and like it's not nice to say. That is a figure in American culture who's kind of been de-racialized as gay.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
But that is a different, and not to say that, look, like Trump is white, old stock American, but you even see that he is kind of a class outcast. Like the other like upper class New Yorkers don't like him, and some of that I think is
and that's the thing here with the like. That's why I think it's AA who uses the word biospirit, because it allows for some wiggle room within, it's not just your DNA, it's also, what Evola calls the metaphysics of race, right? That, you can have a mind that is, you can have a body that is white and a mind that is Italian or black or Jewish, right?
No, definitely. And I realize that this is, this can be a controversial topic, but I think that is.
Well, yeah, I doubt we would ever agree on it, but that would be a topic for a different time, I think.
Yes. So maybe we should move on to the next bulletin.
I think we should move on to next. We're almost 3 hours in. We have to get through the slides.
But it's been a lot of good stuff. I'm so happy we brought Jay Burden on. Actually,
it's a good springboard
way more than expected in terms of like insights. But we'll keep it flowing.
I'll put it this way: I'm kind of limited by my own format to an hour, but you guys talk forever. So now you get unfiltered Jay Burden for 3 hours.
Jay Burden, only on the Longhouse, folks. Yeah. Okay. Rednecks in general.
So, I mean, the connection here is, of course, then Luann Platter. That's Platter. I mean, her name is like taken from some dish at some American deli, right? But she sort of just exists as Hank Hill's nephew, where the family connection is then, if I'm correct, it's Peggy Hill's brother that is pictured on the top right corner, who then had a child with the woman in the bottom right. That is Luann Platter, and Luann has sort of grown up in a trailer park, right, where her father is said to, like, oh, he works at an oil rig, but actually has been like maximum security prison. And he's sort of let out later, where that's kind of revealed. Her mother is also very like problematic type of person, where she's an alcoholic, right, and she can be reasonable sober, but as soon as it gets like one drink in, she's just completely will just wreck every occasion that she's in and start fights, steal stuff, and so on. But I mean, what I want to draw attention to here is really like the American like trailer park culture, because it's also something that seems to be very specifically an American phenomenon. We don't have anything like that here in Scandinavia. I mean, you have people who go to camping for vacations, like they'll have like a trailer home that they will just use to go on at like a 2-week vacation, or live by the beach, or some place a little bit
The
more
people who run
into the country.
like camping resorts would be the closest thing to what the Americans have here. But I mean, that's very few people.
So I can actually offer some insight on this. So I don't have a lot of, this is very much like the American, like the white underclass. And a lot of this does have to do with like the degradation of rural America. But trailers exist in the US for a very specific reason, which is that there's so much bureaucracy around like building code. There's kind of a floor to how much a house costs, and it's quite expensive. Everyone's had, increased prices to, cost of living. But in order to kind of offer homes to kind of like the underclass in a place where the population density isn't high enough for apartments, trailers are technically classified as like vehicles. So they don't have to be built to building code. They're not treated the same way legally. So they're much, much cheaper. And so they're made incredibly poorly. And I actually have some firsthand experience with trailer construction, because I had a friend, I won't go into details, who essentially like got canceled, fired from his job, and had to move across the country, and essentially had no money, and so had to live in a trailer for a little bit. And so I helped him kind of fix up a trailer. And so I actually got to see firsthand how these things are made. And they're made incredibly poorly. Like everything is the cheapest you can imagine. Nothing works. So like for the walls, for instance, aren't made out of, drywall or plaster. They're made out of like particle board, like an IKEA desk. And
really?
So when anything, like the biggest frustration, or one of the biggest ones, was the wall sockets are mounted to particle board. And so you can, in unplugging a lamp, you can pull it out of the wall. It's so poorly made. And you'll never get it to go back in, because there's nothing to like screw it to or nail it to. It's just held in.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are actually made with convict labor, is another one. And I mean, I'll put it this way. We were repairing the floor because it had started to rot. And I was using a reciprocating saw to cut out the subfloor. And I actually ended up almost like hurting myself quite severely. I was just saved by dumb luck, because the blade of the saw grabbed onto metal. And I was like, what in the world? Why is there metal? And it found out that someone who was building the trailer had essentially shimmed the floor, so used it to keep the floor level, had taken a stop sign like you would find on the road, and just used that in the new construction of this trailer. So that's what I mean. That like this is incredibly like low. It's basically like modern tenement housing. Like that is the level of construction. And
wow.
And they're designed to be disposable. Like essentially after 20 years or so, there's just nothing to save. And they're designed to
just leave it there, and then you move on to something else.
Yeah. And so like it speaks to a certain degree both the degradation of like the American like so-called white working class, but also just like the waste of kind of like American consumerism, because these things they're literally disposable homes. They're designed to be financed, paid off, and then hauled away and thrown away. And there's almost nothing you can even do to recycle them, because there's no real materials. There's no wood, there's no steel. It's all just like
I mean, the stop sign that you found in the bottom of that one is probably the most.
Yeah, really. Like that's the
thing.
most real thing I found.
Wow, yeah. I mean, I've seen like homes in the United States built with particle boards, but I was not aware that the like trailers were built with particle boards. And this is something to think about, like when I watch American movies and people get agitated and like they punch the wall, they punch through the walls, right?
Well, yeah, but that's the stupid the super thin 1-inch drywall thing.
It's either thin drywall or it's like it's just like particle boards, and they don't actually last in hurricanes either, right? Because you have a lot of those, and it's just going to get pulled straight up. It has no ability to resist at all. But what would you say, like the price if I wanted to get myself a trailer home? How much would I have to put down?
The first one to admit, I actually don't know because
Speedrunner in the chat says that homes in the USA are 150,000 floor now. Trailers can be gotten for 30 to 60, and they depreciate as vehicles do. So it seems to be 30 to 60.
That's wild. Okay, the average cost of a trailer home is like $40,000, which probably makes sense. And if you get a mortgage on that, that's pretty easy to pay off. But a big part of it is that a lot of the people who live here are like the true like underclass. And I'm not saying that punitively, but like there's a reason that even in my city, which is like a relatively like normal, place to live, like there are a few trailer parks and there are always police there. There's always like, violence, drugs, things like that going on. So they're pretty much white ghettos is the best way to describe them. Like that's that level of existence.
Yeah. So the economics then, I guess you could get the trailer for $40,000. And then I assume you have to pay rent to use the plot as well, because there's somebody who owns the park, and there's a certain monthly payment you have to do to just use a certain part of the plot, or are the plots like government provided or something?
That depends. And again, like this is outside of what I understand. I just my personal like social class. I don't know anyone who lives in a trailer really. Like I've known people who've had to live there, but it was kind of like it was the exception to the rule. But I do know that a lot of people, especially in these kind of like more depressed farming communities, where essentially like families have lots of children, over a couple generations, and they still all have like ancestral right to property, but it kind of breaks down to the level where there's, they own, fractions of what used to be a farm. And I realize Glow in the Dark and some other guys are saying there's trailers, and I completely realize this. I'm talking about like the lowest of the low, like the really like badly.
I'm just hearing there's this song by James McCurdy, Choctaw Bingo. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't.
All right, that's what's running through my head right now. Which if anyone in chat is is aware, maybe that's the correct image I have. You can let me know. Okay, sorry, carry on.
No, but what will also happen is in very rural areas where you have, again, like these farms that break down over time as there are more and more heirs to it. People will have like fractional parts of land, where they may only have like, 1 or 2 hectares, which obviously you can't farm and it's not worth enough to sell, but they will essentially have ancestral land with like a series of trailers on them. So they'll buy one, as it deteriorates, they'll buy another one. And so you'll see these properties out in the middle of nowhere that have like, 1 inhabited trailer and then 2 rotting to the side, that were kind of like last decade's trailers, and again, like I feel bad for these people because obviously like a lot of them are, on welfare. A lot of them are, pretty heavily involved in drugs. It's kind of like the fate of rural America has gotten grimmer and grimmer. You see more and more of these.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's quite interesting to hear about. Let's see.
Glow in the Dark says, "Hey, my family had a trailer for 60 years with constant fixing it. It will last a while, but you need to be aware." So apparently there is hope but I mean, if you're in the situation where you buy one of these shitty trailers, I would assume that very often you might not have the resources or the capacity to keep it.
I hope Glow in the Dark's trailer wasn't made of particle boards. And I mean, like the value of it, it's not like investing in a house. The value will go down every year. Unlike from a house, and if it's made from crap materials, then there's nothing to do, right? It's just like Jay says, you just throw it out.
And I see Speedrunner in chat saying that obviously this is I'm not speaking of everyone who lives in a trailer by any means. Like there are like different communities with different cultures. Like I get that. But what I'm saying is that like specifically like the Luan style like extreme dysfunction, the like ghetto level is what I'm talking about.
Yes. So I mean, we could get back to Luan a little bit here. I mean, she exists in the show to create awkward situations for Hank, but she also has some arcs of her own. Like she tries to make a sort of class journey, right? She tries to become a hairdresser, but she doesn't have the aptitude to do it. So there's a lot of back and forth about her trying to pass school, and then she tries to go to college. That doesn't work. So she ends up then getting in a relationship with the guy to the right there. That's called Lucky, who was voiced by Tom Petty, I think. Who's the guy who wrote Free Falling?
Yeah, it was. I will say, like, I think Tom Petty's music is like Eagles tier terrible, like boomer rock, which might make me some enemies. But I think that he is a highly underrated voice actor. I realize that The Simpsons is pretty much disposable humor, but he's, I think, the most prolific celebrity guest in The Simpsons. And so there's a whole like subgenre of Tom Petty voices background character that's kind of fun.
Yes, and he does look a little bit like the character. I mean, Lucky is a little bit uglier maybe, but he has the same kind of like chip tooth thing going on for him. And I mean, I talked about infertility previously, but there is like this robustness to the lower class. It's kind of like low IQ underclass where like regardless of how shitty things get, they still manage to continue existing and to replace themselves, right? Because they actually do have a kid during the show. So what's that term, like the Spengler? I don't remember. Like Spengler has like this term for it when we're at the end of the civilizational cycle, right? And people just move out of the cities to just go live in the woods or something, and they're just completely uninterested in any academic pursuit or any high culture and stuff. They just want to farm and have kids, right? I just don't remember their what the name was for that particular, when people get to that stage. But I feel like, some of these people like Luan are that's kind of where they are, right?
Well, it's the true, like, it's the American, like, North FC Grug brain.
Yeah.
Yes. But unlike, I mean, it kind of depends on where the working class is, but like the North FC Celts, they're, sorry to say it, but like they look fucking horrible. Like they're absolutely kind of mutant-like, but you have certain areas where like the working class or a lot of these lower class people are quite attractive, and I think it has to do with like high time preference. Like you have a lot of people who will just meet each other and they will have sex on, let's like, purely superficial reasons, right? Very very quick and very much based on love at first sight, and but of course that produces pretty people because they always go for like the most handsome heartthrob alpha man, or the like the woman with the best features and so on. And so I've seen a lot of people who work in like, say, like lower end service, like restaurant business and hotels and stuff like that, like in Southern Europe. And like, I mean, they're surprisingly attractive. I think they're usually more attractive on average than the middle class, which can afford to be a little bit uglier because of their long time preference and
there's massive brains because they read books.
Yes, I mean they have all these specializations and they're more emphasized. They're focused more on the long term, right? So you can have a lot of these like soy jack looking men and like these women with thick glasses and everything, and so like beauty is a little bit less emphasized.
Guys that say like, what really turns me on in a woman is her thoughts, man.
Her intelligence. Yeah, I want a nerd.
Intelligence, that's the most beautiful thing. Yeah, I'm not a tits or an ass man. I'm an intelligence man.
I'm a brain, some head man.
Ladies, yeah.
Yes.
God.
But I mean, it's a sort of interesting topic to get into, where I feel like it's a kind of usually like the upper and lower classes are usually better looking than the middle class in most cases, especially like with people like, say, who are like self-made billionaires, right? They tend to be good looking, or at least if they come from self-made billionaires, they're good looking. Like, say, like the Trump family, for instance. We have this correlation between beauty and high intelligence in men, because, say, someone like Fred Trump, who becomes like a multimillionaire. So he marries a pretty woman, and then he has kids who are good looking. Then they're married into money, and then they'll marry the supermodels, and their kids will marry the supermodels. So you go from like Fred Trump to Eric Trump or something. Or like the Ackerman family or something. They just get better looking for every generation because they just keep like marrying these Russian supermodels.
Well, and there's kind of this symbiotic relationship between like real world like Luann's, because there's like a whole, it's like a stock character in media of the extremely attractive trailer trash girl, and that person does exist, and it actually like it tends to be a lot of a huge driver of social mobility. So, and not to say that
it's your ticket out of the trailer park, yeah.
Right, and not to say that my mom's family is distinctly, at least her parents are not. They were essentially lower middle class, and my dad's family was upper middle class. And the reason that they married is because, well, my mom, at the time was obviously like she was attractive, and she essentially got to kind of like jump a pretty significant class barrier. Like my grandpa on her side, like no one ever graduated, no one ever went to university, everyone worked manual jobs. Versus my dad's family, which is very like laptop class-esque. And so like that's not a huge social jump, but that happens fairly often. And so like the it's the stereotype of like not particularly smart, but super like lights out attractive redneck exists. That is a very strong theme in American culture. And that's just kind of like baseline human nature stuff.
They do exist, and they dress like this as well. This is something that I've noticed. They sort of like, I mean, usually in these areas in the United States, it's quite warm, almost year round. But they will dress extremely skimpily, like with these. They'll just be the shorts and the sort of bras, and they'll just that's what they wear. It's like nothing, nothing else. It's very few places that I see women dress that way. I mean, do they still do that, or has there become some more like sort of modest standards?
Oh no, not at all. And a big part of that also is that, and I don't mean to romanticize this, because there has been an immense amount of degradation. Like there are just fewer and fewer like healthy young women in America, period, but specifically in kind of like of lower class whites. And you've seen a lot of adoption, like a weird fusion of like redneck and ghetto culture. In some cases, like literally and genetically. But there's a reason that like skimpy cutoff shorts are called like Daisy Dukes, right? And it's, named after a Southern character, who is a woman in cutoff jean shorts. So that is very much a I guess like an accurate version of that.
It's from Dukes of Hazzard, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Which is, the tied off, button-up shirt with the, the giant, completely legitimate double Ds, and so that is very accurate to life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, just finishing up, I think her voice actor is absolutely terrific in like trying to make her sound correctly for the role that she plays. She sounds like genuinely like what do you call like this being of nature? I don't know what the correct English term is.
True life, I guess.
Yeah, it's like this sort of female creature who's just like completely. It is like this nature being. Basically, there's really like no long-term thinking. It's all about like this kind of the impulse in the moment kind of, and of course there is something attractive to that for a man, especially if you are a man of like a more intellectual persuasion. I think you will be drawn to like it's like the counter pole of the sort of like low time preference, high IQ man to try to find something like attractive.
Saying she's feral.
Yes, perfect.
I'm sorry,
well,
it's 3 hours
it's close
and
enough.
My brain power is melting away.
Well, that's good. I think we could flip the board and just go look at the last slide. It's really more
this
of
is the last one.
Summary here. But
my God,
I mean, these are things that I've touched on previously. I just wanted to, because I've already covered the concept, but there's so many episodes that I've tried to, pick some of the ones that I liked here with all of these characters that try to subvert order in a sense in the world of King of the Hill. In some small way, they will come into the world of Hank Hill and try to subvert kind of like the natural conservative order, and Hank is able to triumph, right? in all of these episodes. And that's kind of like what I feel is the supreme tragedy of King of the Hill, is that, you know, Hank wins all the battles in a sense, but he loses the war. Like the soul of the nation is essentially broken down from like the past progressive culture, even though like he did everything he could in every situation to try to mitigate all of this BS that's introduced by the bureaucrats and all of these degenerates that come into, whether it's his workplace or it's the neighborhood or any of these, you know, the kind of safe zones.
Man, that guy on the bottom left reminded me of, in that episode, they're at like an ice cream parlor, and this guy who's pictured here is like, he's embarrassed to be there because he's like a cool dad, and Hank is boring, right? And
Yes.
his friend comes in and is like, "What are you doing here?" And what is he? He calls this guy in the green t-shirt jokingly like, "Don't be such a Ronald Reagan," and Hank goes like, "No, don't call him that." Like, as he's insulted that he's being called Ronald Reagan, this lefty guy.
Yeah, the lefty character is like the episode about permissive parenting, right? Where they try to, well, we used to be disciplinarians. Damn, son.
Speedrunner with the massive
Motherload
$50
tip.
donation. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thanks.
It means so much, isn't that the line? Yeah.
I tip off my hat to that tip. That's amazing. Yeah, thanks
Quotes
for,
or whatever. Yeah.
well,
Sorry,
yeah.
continue.
But the character in the bottom, like, we used to be disciplinarian parents, but we try to have a friendship, friendly relationship to our kid, right? So they'll go like drinking with their son, right? Go to parties with their kid and try to be hip like that. And it's of course like this completely cringe, degenerate behavior. And Hank react. I mean, you know Hank, so he's going to react negatively to it and try to resist and push that out of the way and see how they can deal with that, right? Because I mean, especially when you have a kid, you're always going to be dealing with like these parents with completely alternative worldviews to what you consider orderly and proper. And you know, the show itself actually displays like this type of lifestyle as being unsustainable. Like this, it's shown to be something that's not really a workable strategy in the long term. So that's what I think is sort of the
weird thing in
inherent
that episode
conservatism.
is that, Peggy gets sort of like he gets fooled by it, right? He's like wowed by the lifestyle, how cool they are.
I have a question, and this is like largely off topic, but is permissive parenting kind of popular in the Nordic countries? Because that's a very much an American stereotype, and not only American, but also I was in the Russian novel Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. He has I'm not sure if that's how you say his last name, but he has a similar comment about like essentially like Swedish permissive parenting, and like it's obviously played off as a joke. But is that an accurate stereotype or is that fake?
Well, we'll answer it. Hang on a moment. We have another here, $5 from Glow in the Dark. A warning sign, people, is that she has a great personality. Run fast as you can.
Quoting American Psycho, there are no women with good personalities, right? That's
exactly.
But
anyway, well, yes and no. I think there are individual constraints, right? There are individual families, but in general, it depends on what you're talking about.
See, what comes to my mind here is actually Haralaya, where he made this, I think in one of these shows where he talked about the difference between like parenting in Scandinavia and parenting in the United States, where regardless if it's like the permissive party with your kids style or it's like the more conservative style, it seems like the American parents are a lot more involved with their kids than Scandinavian parents.
And
it's really
you can
more
go back and look at I think it's one of the early episodes. It's called On Freedom, where we dive into that, where pretty much the state apparatus has set it up in such a way that, you know, once you turn 18, you don't really have to rely on your parents if you're smart enough.
Yeah, because the student loans you can get, like you don't need to have be guaranteed by your parents. You know, it's not like student loan forgiveness, but it's a very low interest rate loan. It's easy to get, and The terms of the contract are very good, and so it's put up in such a way that you could separate yourself from your parents quite easily. And there seems to be like much less of an interest in Norwegian parents in being involved in, like, directly involved in their children's lives and their decisions and so on. In the same
Well,
way
I think
that
that's a different sort of it's a per home basis. I've always been told, in retrospect, that people would be like, well, your parents were always super strict, but I never saw that in that way. There was nothing my parents ever demanded of me that wasn't, something that I deserved, or that I, that was unreasonable. Like, is it strict to tell your 15-year-old son that he should do his homework? Right. I mean,
well, yeah, I do think if you have like proper Norwegian middle class parents, they will be strict on some level, like at least demand things from their children in terms of responsibility.
exactly.
And
There was
so
no
on.
demand that wasn't met with like an appropriate sort of gain or reward, or or that I could see like, oh yeah, this is actually good for me if I do this thing, right?
Yes, because the middle class can't be it can't be reproduced properly without some level of discipline, right? Even though it's kind of it's not like this kind of
Now, that
authoritarian personality
being
discipline.
said, there's, when it comes to like underage drinking and stuff like that, there's a culture in Norway where that is very prevalent. So in that sense, there's a lot more permissiveness, and I think a lot of parents feel that their kids are going to get away with it anyway. So it's better that I know that he's doing it, and that he calls me if he gets into trouble, right?
Right, I understand. And sorry, I'm
Yeah.
not trying to make this an even longer show, but I was just curious.
Probably. I always found that stuff incredibly gay. Like, I mean, I never wanted my parents to know about that stuff anyway, right?
No, I certainly agree in that sense, right?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
if you're a teenager anyway, you don't want to call your parents. That's sort of the point, right?
Yeah, at least for me. I mean, the point was never to the drinking in the first place. It was like the transgression. It's a
Exactly.
weird thing.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that I would just say is like kind of a negative. And I did not grow up like this, but you see a lot in the kind of like more conservative American culture, is that things like, like kind of like alcohol specifically have this odd mystique about them. Like if you never see your parents drink, there is this kind of stereotype of those kids kind of go wild, and a lot of them develop like pretty severe alcohol issues because of it. But that's again, another digression.
It's a very, it's one of those things where it's a middle ground, right? It's one of those things where if you ban it outright, I think that's something we could learn from the more Mediterranean cultures.
No, don't give them anything. Don't yield to Med.
No, I think it's a bit more of an easing into what alcohol is and how it affects you, instead of just like, hey, you're 18, here's a 6-pack, go have fun, right?
There's probably also something to be said in the difference between like cultures that drink like hard liquor versus wine versus beer, because one of the really negative things about like Scotch, Irish, backwoods culture, which is, to a certain degree, is what kind of birthed things like NASCAR and bootlegging, is that it's hard liquor culture, and that has led to a lot of dysfunction. And you even see that in kind of like what people like Carlyle wrote about, the Irish, versus the kind of more relaxed Mediterranean, like wine culture, or kind of like, Northern European like beer culture with like, not Northern, but like the Germans and people like that.
There's this great story of that I have from my family. One time we were at a vacation in Italy, and we visited a called a trattoria, which is there's a thing in Italy where there's like tiers of restaurants, and there's one tier which is called something, which is basically like a tavern. You're basically in someone's home, more or less. And so we were visiting there for dinner, right? And the old woman who was serving was placing wine glasses all around, and she gets to my sister, who at that point was probably like 14, right? 15. So she places it down, and my dad goes like, no. She's not supposed to have wine. You know, where we come from, you can't have wine until you're 18. And this woman goes like, you can't have any wine until you're 18, and that's when you're allowed to drink wine. So when is she supposed to learn how to drink wine? She asked him, and he didn't have an answer for it. So,
Yeah, and I think
but I
that
don't remember if she ended up getting any wine. But I mean, there is something to be said about demystifying it. But there's a difference between what this character in Hank Hill and like not letting your kids see you drink alcohol, right?
right, and that's kind of a more extreme version of that. But that is that is part of the same culture. Obviously, Hank Hill is a beer drinking American, but
Actually,
it's interestingly enough. Sorry, last digression, I promise. But there's a episode between. I guess you shouldn't make promises you can't keep. But there's an episode where kind of Hank Hill gets booted out from the school haunted house by a meddling evangelical, who basically gets Luann to believe that Halloween is satanic.
oh yeah, yeah.
And as someone who my parents weren't involved, but I, because it was kind of the only game in town, so to speak, I went to like hardcore evangelical events a lot as a kid, and so it's funny because I kind of lived through that, and that is very real. But I thought it was an interesting bit of I guess like an interesting bit of commentary about the like, oh, I forgot what they called it. It's like Hell House, because I actually went to. Well, no, it's sorry that in the course of the show, she holds a like Christian themed evangelical event on Halloween to essentially.
Yeah, and there's like she's like has these like dolls, and it's like, oh, they're gonna have sex and then they die. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. One, those are real. I went to them, and two, that is kind of like the flip side of like conservative American culture that either doesn't drink or hides the fact that they drink. Because it's this like kind of like moralistic, like extremely devout culture. So they are both in the same area. They're like more like standard. Drink some low weight beers with the guys over a football game.
Exactly.
And the culture I'm talking about, where you don't drink at all or you don't tell your kids you drink, is more of that kind of like crazed Jesus camp evangelical type.
Right. I think referring to the previous topic here, Bo Gruntman says it's extremely accurate in my opinion. My parents didn't demand anything in terms of doing homework, not drinking, etc. Great show, by the way. Well, I mean, maybe I don't know. Maybe it's a difference between Sweden and Norway, or where you are in Sweden, but that sounds extremely lax. But I mean, I also had friends whose parents more or less didn't care, as long as they didn't, don't get caught by the police. Basically, you can get away with anything. But back to your point about I lost my train of thought. Help me out here, Luddy. Did you have any commentary?
I mean, just my 2 cents there, because I've been very adjacent to a lot of this evangelical culture that you mentioned, where drinking is kind of taboo, right? It's not something that you even talk about, but of course that it usually ends up with like some kind of shadow economy or something. Like these kids, and some of them drink and some of them don't, and it becomes like kind of this inside thing with them. That's see, I'm trying to look
especially here in Norway. I mean, you're not going to get away as much as you try. You're not going to get away from it. Like, your kid's going to be at a place where there's alcohol consumed, and depending on your how you raise them, they might not drink, but you're going to have to roll those dice.
The Zoomers, actually, that they seemed like more prone to just be sober, like to be anti-alcohol. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing.
No, I noticed that as well.
Okay, it's funny that because I've heard that now. I've heard that now twice, and maybe this speaks more to who I am and who I hang out with. But I had no idea that was a stereotype, because I'm not to say like I'm the world's biggest drinker. I consider myself like a social drinker. I don't really drink by myself, but if it's a party, and I mean, you know how it goes. And so I was very surprised to learn that was a generational stereotype.
It very much was, but not necessarily for me. Well, it's a weird thing where it's like up until you hit the age of 18, and then there's like it's usually a wild period between like 18 and 23, and then you settle down pretty much. What do you think, Ludwig?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, with my generation, like sort of mid millennials, it was the idea is like, when you start drinking, it's like the more the better. The culture is just all about getting smashed, and if you're not down
Very
with that,
much, yeah.
you're missing out on something. Like, I mean, you pay a big price for that if you're gonna like run it sober. But
But I did notice that in my sister, who is very much a zoomer compared to me, there was a lot less drinking and a lot more focus on sort of the mixology part of it, right?
yeah,
It's
I
more
mean,
of
the
a
Zoomers have like their own kind of like drug culture. They get into weird stuff like, say, ketamines, for instance, which seems to be like this entirely just purely Zoomer thing.
So
Uh,
I will say I was one of I work fairly regularly on a big cattle farm, and when I told the guy who owns the farmer, that people were essentially like using ketamine recreationally because it's an agricultural drug, right? Like it's a tranquilizer for large animals.
Horse tranquilizer, yeah.
Literally, that's essentially
Yeah,
what
yeah.
it is. He was absolutely astonished, and it was one of those like it very much was that like Hank Hill "Blah" reaction, which is like a very real one. But it was
Right.
he was absolutely astonished because now they have this thing, where essentially like electronic pharmacies are starting to become big, where you essentially have a Zoom call with a doctor and say like, yes, I am, checks notes, depressed and have back pain. Please give me ketamine. And so essentially they're like handing that out like candy now.
Interesting.
Yeah, I haven't seen it handed out like candy, but it is apparently like within acceptable, I guess, discourse within the sort of psychological psychotherapy community that ketamine can cure depression. Because I've seen this pop up in Oslo, like they have these ketamine clinics where you go to be treated for depression, and they'll give you a sort of dose of ketamine. Although, I mean, if you're doing that just to get the hold of the drug, I recommend you don't, because like it's extremely expensive to go to these clinics as opposed to the people who just buy it off the black market. So.
Okay, glow in the dark for another $5. My area disapproved of hard liquor and hated drunkenness because if you can't think straight, you will do something you will regret. Mostly, no driving. I mean, that's something that is common with where I grew up as well. I think.
That's definitely a more recent thing in the U.S. of like viewing drunk driving as like an evil, because for a long time, especially in more rural areas, it was kind of socially acceptable. So my old boss, the one that I said reminded me of Cotton, he was very much kind of like a man out of time, and he had this old 70s Cadillac that he referred to as his drinking car, and that was the car that he owned specifically to drive drunk. Which is
Because it didn't matter if you dinged it up, is that it?
Exactly. It's like, it's so big, I can't hurt myself. And I'm like, well, Mark, you realize you could kill other people? And he's like, well, I haven't killed anyone yet. And I didn't find that argument as convincing as he seemed to. But
Right. No, I've lost friends to American drunk drivers. So
That's sad, but I have an even better one, because I met an American economics professor who said that he likes to like drunk drive boats, right? And I mean, he had made a lot of money on like real estate investments, so he had basically bought a small lake so he could drunk drive his boat around on.
to be fair, that's something you could do in Norway for quite a while as well.
Yes.
That's a recent rule that you can't be smashed and pilot a boat.
So this is a great like rural America story. So in one of the kind of small towns in my area, there's this guy who got his license taken away for driving drunk. And so in America, they have these like, I guess they have them everywhere, but they're pretty common for people to own these like riding 0-turn lawnmowers. And so he had the great idea to, well, if I can't drive my car drunk, I'll just drive my lawnmower on the road. And so he would drive his lawnmower around town while drunk. And eventually the police got so tired of writing him tickets that they just let him do it. And so he was the drunk lawnmower pilot of middle of nowhere Virginia.
That's the things you get in small towns that, just doesn't happen anywhere else. It's like, oh yeah, that's the drunk lawnmower guy. We just let him do it.
This is what they took from you, right?
This is what they took from you, yeah.
But I mean, I did come to remember something is that there is this, culture of kind of abstainers, avholdsmennesker. I guess that's what you call it in Norway, like where they have these lodges for people who just like sort of pledge to be non-alcoholic for life and so on, related to a lot of the problems that arise through this kind of hard liquor culture. But I don't know much about it. I just remember like being younger and being told about this by my parents and the parents of my friends and so on. Do you have any knowledge of that, Walrus?
Hard liquor?
No, like this kind of abstinence, this kind of abstainer lodges, right?
Lodges? No, but I mean, I did grow up in the Bible Belt, and every
it's
Christian
sort of
around was that
avholdsmen,
way.
Where they seem to actually organize as well. It's not just some label that you give yourself.
I see what you're saying. No, but that was probably just eaten up by the Christian, sort of evangelical groups.
Yeah, I see.
Because I know
I thought it was I thought it was a movement that was sort of separate from that had like a separate existence from the kind of
probably
Christian community.
Does on a general scale, but where I live, I think it's very much intertwined. You guys got Mormons? I don't think so.
Yeah, we do actually.
We do?
Yeah, in my town, I've talked to them.
What?
I mean,
Where
I
are the
used to have
Mormons?
this.
Oh, wait, hang on. Yeah, no, there are Mormons who come here from the U.S. because they've been at my door, like wanting to talk about.
Yes, I mean they have like missionary posts here, but I mean, what a miserable place to be a missionary. Like it's, I mean, you get to have a high living standard, but converting people here, it's like mission impossible, right? It's probably a lot easier to go to Africa or just do the Book of Mormon thing. Convert people down there, you can actually score a few. I mean, if you're up here trying to win people over, I mean, it's really difficult. But I have I mean, I had a period where I'd like to see how far I could go with some of these missionaries, so I would just try to invite them home and sit and have talks with them and see what they would try to do and how they would handle my objections and so on. So I have 3 copies actually of the Mormon, what's they called, like the Book of Mormon, on my shelf that they gave me. I mean, I'm not come to read the whole thing, but they were quite generous in terms of they giving me copies and making me read passages from it. But it's kind of a thread that I've left. I've left on the floor a bit. I just told that but it wasn't for me. So
Nietzsche's horse says abstaining wholly from drinking feels just as controlling as an addiction. Well, maybe that's a cope, but I mean, it's just too built into my culture. It's in my bones that drinking is part of it. Not that it's and I'm not I'm a very much a prude when it comes to drinking. I have my my one beer tonight or something, and then maybe I'll have something on Saturday, but unless it's a party, I generally just don't drink.
Yeah, drinking is very much a social thing, right? So I've
you get together and then you just get smashed with your friends, right? That's that's the Viking way. Okay, it's been 3.5 hours. I mean, we could probably go on for all night, but
is that the record? If I hit the Longhouse record for the long stream,
I think you might have.
We'll look through it. I do suspect. I think we had one that went for 3 hours and 45.
Okay, so if you want to go, I'm losing brain cells by the minute, but if you want to continue for 15 more minutes, you will beat the record.
No. I'm not gonna hold you guys that long. But thank you guys for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. Before we go, I'm sorry I didn't front load the shilling. That's a bad form of me. Let everyone know what your socials are, Burton.
All right. Obviously, there's the Jay Burden Show, which is a regular, roughly twice a week interview show that's available on YouTube under the Jay Burden YouTube channel. And then also you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio-only podcasts. You can find the 10 most recent episodes there. I think that your audience has really latched on to the audio version of my podcast because I can see the demographics, and my number one country for listeners is Denmark, which is a little bit odd, but welcome all the same. And you guys can also find me on Twitter, jburden. I have a Telegram, which is somewhat harder to find, but just go to my channel and it's linked there. And that's all my shilling out of the way.
Hey, Luddic Path, do you have any new memes that you wanna push on us?
Yeah, no, I'd like it to be a surprise. I think I have something funny coming up. I do sort of suspect that I'm being like slightly throttled by YouTube because it's I'm not reaching as many people as I used to. It might just be my content being like crap.
You have become more explicit in your right winginess. I think that's hurting you, unfortunately.
Yeah, the people are just clicking the report button a lot more consistently. That's what I suspect. It's been piling up, right?
Exactly. Okay, well, in the link down in the description below, you have the links to our Longhouse Clips channel. If you, for some reason, don't want to sit through 3.5 hours of whatever this was, Luddic usually chops it up into more manageable forms. We also have the link to the Telegram channel for A Walrus, my Twitter, if you want to follow me there. The Element Matrix channel, which is more or less like Discord, but it's encrypted and you can talk to people in this community here. I think that's everything. Well, there's also the Subscribe Star, if you're interested in donating a set amount every month to this show. Otherwise, I thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Remember to like and comment and subscribe, do all those things. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.